Yes, Samia.
Okay, sir. Am I audible, Ria?
Yes, Samia, you are.
Okay, thank you. Good afternoon, all. As you already know, today is the first day of the 3-day workshop on practical criticism, the Practical Critic, scheduled to be conducted from 12 November 2020 to 14 November 2020. Today we will be having the inaugural function followed by two sessions. The first session will be led by Ms. Parvati Salil, a talented poet and critic who makes it a point to participate in all major literary festivals in Kerala. She is currently doing her MA in Gender Studies from the SOAS University of London. This is led by Mr. Anthony Jose, who is known for his scholarship and his lucid way of explaining literary theory, and he is currently preparing for his PhD. Now I invite Ria to read out the guidelines for the proper functioning of the sessions. Over to you, Ria.
Am I audible, Samia?
Yes, you are
Am I
audible.
audible, Samia? Okay, thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Here are a few instructions for the participants to keep in mind. The sessions will be streamed only through the YouTube link each day provided. The feedback link will be shared in the Google Classroom. The registered participants can access it from there. Certificates will be given only to those participants who have 90% attendance and have submitted the practical criticism paper on or before of 30th of November. Kindly place your questions only in the YouTube link chat box and do not post any other comments. Kindly enter your details in the Google Classroom. The registered participants can access it from there. Certificates will be given only to those participants who have 90% attendance and have submitted
Thank
the
you, Ria.
practical criticism paper on or before of 30th of November.
Now I invite our HOD, Professor Simi Rachel Matthew, for the welcome address. Over to you, ma'am.
Good afternoon to all the participants present here. The Vice Principal of CMS College, Dr. Mini Chako, the convener of this course, Dr. Apu Jacob John, the course director, Mr. Ditto Prasad, the comparers, all the participants of this meeting from within the college and those outside. The critical and the creative have always gone down in history as binaries, where Matthew Arnold, in his function of criticism, in his essay, which speaks about England and France, he deplores the lack of a critical turn of mind in the 19th century when he compares England with France, which he feels was more critical than creative. And he expressed the need for England to sit up and take notice. And that exactly is what the critical turn of mind or the critical consciousness is all about. Sitting up and taking notice. Now, the critical consciousness, as a function, the critical consciousness intervenes into reality, changes it, and creates a discourse that initiates development. In fact, the COVID that has destroyed the peace and calm in the world, even the COVID dictum dictates the same: break the chain. And I think that is what the critical consciousness is all about: breaking the chain, the linearity, and going off at a point from where you initiate change. The Practical Critic, today's program, is an attempt by the Department of English, CMS College, to instill this very need for the critical spirit. This is a 3-day program with the inauguration and the first 2 sessions being held today. This program is being hosted for all those from outside and from inside the college. Specifically from the CMS College participants would be our 3rd-year students who we hope will benefit from this. We have 2 guest speakers for today, Ms. Parvati Salil and Mr. Anthony Jose. Miss Parvati Salil is very well known to us, and we both of them to this meeting. We are happy to have you here, joining in with us and speaking to our students. By protocol, I welcome the principal of our college, Dr. Mini Chako, who has taken the trouble to come here and be present with us as we begin this venture. I welcome the course convener, the course director, all the student participants within CMS and outside, all the faculty of CMS College, and any teacher faculty that is present from outside CMS. Once more, welcoming all of you to this 3-day program, to the first session of this 3-day program. I ask the course director, Mr. Ditto Prasad, to take up the program from this point. Thank you.
Good evening all, and welcome once again to the Practical Critic, a workshop on practical criticism. I am Ditto Prasad, Assistant Professor of English Department, CMS College. We have 2 speakers today. I'll introduce them briefly and spend the rest of the day getting to know them better through their views on reading, writing, and criticism. Our first speaker, Parvati Salil, is a poet, friend. She completed her PG in English from St. Teresa's Nagalam and won the Young India Scholarship of Ashoka University, where she read on gender studies and literary criticism. At present, she is reading for a PG in gender studies from the School of Oriental and African Studies, University of London. We're all looking forward to hearing from you. Second speaker, Mr. Anthony Jose, did his post-graduation in English from SH College, Ernakulam, and is presently preparing for his doctoral studies. His PG thesis on the representation of Jews in Kottayam was highly appreciated. Anthony, welcome to CMS College and to the Critic. I wish that the sessions will raise certain questions, at least help us ask questions differently, as I believe is the aim of practical criticism. Do poems look different if they are presented in isolation from the circumstances in which they are written? Or do our critical responses to them change if we add in some context, some historical record of how the poem was written? Do our views of a poem or for that matter prose piece change if we hear it being read out? Does it change if we see the original manuscript? Or instead, just how I. Richards summarized its slogan of practical criticism, does it change if it's only words on the page? I'm wishing all the participants a good time. May you all have an insightful day ahead. Thank you for hearing me out.
Thank you, sir. Principal, CMS College, Kottayam, for the inauguration of the workshop. Ma'am, would you please?
Dear Sini Rachel Matthew, Head Department of English and the President of the program, Convener of this course, Mr. Appu Jacob John, the course director, Mr. Ditto Prasad, the speakers of the day, Ms. Parvati Salil and Mr. Anthony Jose, the students of the department, teachers, and dear friends from outside the college. Thank you for inviting me for this session. Criticism, as we all know, is the analysis and judgment of the merits and faults of a literary work. But we all know that it's very easy to say that, and it's easier said than done. I congratulate the Department of English for organizing this practical workshop on the nuances of this aspect. I welcome Ms. Parvati Sir, who will be introducing you to this practical session. Welcome both the speakers on behalf of the CMS College family, and I declare the workshop inaugurated. Happy learning to all of you.
Thank you, ma'am. Without any further delay, we begin our first session. May I invite Ms. Parvati Sel? Over to you, ma'am.
Good afternoon, everyone. Am I audible?
Yes, ma'am, you're
Yes, ma'am,
audible.
you are.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. I'm so happy and excited to join you for another session. And I would like to thank Professor Sini Rachel Matthew, Professor Minnie Chaku, Dr. Appu Jacob John, Ditto sir, and everyone else. And today I would like to just sort of present what I would like to do is to give you an introduction about practical criticism. I would actually like to tell you about how it sort of evolved and the decline and its revival. So that's basically what I'm trying to do. So I'd like to sort of divide the session into three, in the sense that first I just sort of give a very basic introduction to practical criticism, and then Anthony would elaborate on it. So I would basically talk about the first generation of practical critics in depth, and then the next part is where I'd like to talk a little bit about what practical criticism is and what is close reading, and then also talk about the central text in the repertoire of practical and or new criticism. And then I would just like to talk about a text which was published recently, which brings together a very different, very modern, a very contemporary idea of practical criticism, but again with nuances of new historicism as well. And I would also like to end with a very brief example of how two critics, contemporary critics, Derek Attridge and Henry Staten, would close read a poem. So that's sort of how I've divided it. Am I speaking too fast? Am I clear? Am I audible?
Yes, ma'am, you're perfectly audible.
Yeah, and I would really like it if some of you could keep the cameras on, because it's kind of awkward to sort of look at myself and speak, but up to you. Um, all right, thank you so much for that, and let me just go ahead. So the first part is where I'm just trying to talk about the history of practical, not just practical criticism, basically literary theorizing from Aristotle to F.R. Lewis, which is just a very crude, very basic outline. So the first bit is where we talk about theoretical positions about literature has always existed. So which is where I'm trying to refer to the Latin and Greek origins. But then it was just that this this was always there, but then it's just that this was never the focus of the discipline till the 1970s. And then it talks about, uh, so let's just sort of go back to the um, the history of literary theorizing, where I would like to start by discussing about Aristotle's Poetics in the 4th century BC. So the central idea is that critical theory has always existed, it predates literary criticism of individual works. So this is where I'd like to begin with Aristotle's Poetics. We know the famous definition of tragedy, and then Aristotle sort of insists that literature is about character, and the character is revealed through action, and then we talk about the plot. So here, what is important is that, in a way, it does. Peter Barry writes that it is a quote unquote reader centered approach to literature, but again, to some extent it is debatable. Again, I would like to sort of hint at the fact that I'm aware of the fact that a lot of these arguments that I'd like to present could be debated. We can always argue for and against them, but then as an introduction, I'd like to leave it there. Here, I'd like to sort of talk about the reader-centered aspect of it, which basically talks about it um, how it evokes feelings of sympathy and empathy for the plight of the protagonist. Basically, we're talking about catharsis and how it facilitates the audience, or how it enables the audience to identify with the plight of the. Now, coming to, again, I'd like to sort of give a very brief introduction about all of these. And the next critic is the next prestigious name in English writing about literature is Sidney and his Apology for Poetry. Now, what is really important here is about how Sidney projected literature's central purpose as the giving of pleasure. So, and this is where we could sort of make a distinction with philosophy, which is more of which has more to do with serious and serious pursuits. So here, what Sidney did is to project literature's purpose as projects it more as a source of delight. And this is where we can also consider the influence of both Horace and Ovid in terms of delightful instruction and speaking picture, poem as a speaking picture. So what is important is how Sidney, wanted to present literature as a source of, as something that's pleasurable. And this is not to say that, or in a way that literature as a source of pleasure is more important than its didactic aspects, or and then another thing that has to be noted is that Sidney also wrote about literature in general. He was not really writing about any individual text or an individual author. He was writing about literature in general. Now, the next critic, again, obviously, I'm aware of the fact that we'd have to talk about Dryden, and obviously there are a lot of critics and theoreticians to talk about, but for the purpose to present the dominant, streams of thought, I would like to eliminate a few critics and perspectives. But the next critic I would like to talk about is Samuel Johnson, and Samuel Johnson's Lives of the Poets and Prefaces to Shakespeare, and how they were major steps forward in critical theory, and as the start of the English tradition of practical criticism. Now, what is important here is when we're talking about Samuel Johnson's works, we see that I've already mentioned that with Sidney, the criticism was criticism about literature in general and not about any individual writer or work. And when we're talking about Samuel Johnson, there is a radical shift, because he wrote about Shakespeare. So that way, what is important here is that criticism began to be focused on individual writers and or text. And prior to this, it was only the Bible which was subjected to intensive scrutiny as this. And then the extension of this practice to works other than those thought to be the direct product of divine inspiration. Now is a that is a significant change here. So, and then I'd like to talk about Wordsworth, Coleridge, Keats, and Shelley. Primarily, we're trying to talk about critical theory in the work of Romantic poets. So I'd like to sort of bring in nuances of their criticism as well as, like a little bit of their poetry together. Yeah, so when we talk about Wordsworth, let me just put it very simply for you. Let's talk about Wordsworth, Coleridge, Shelley, and Keats. Now, first one, obviously, Wordsworth's work, Preface to the Lyrical Ballads of 1798 and the second edition in 1800. Now, what is important is that we can see that it is a blend. Till then, it was, you see, everything to do with the emphasis on ornate language and complexity. And with Wordsworth, what we see is that, it sort of brings together. It is a blend of high literature and popular literature. And what is important here is that the central idea, obviously, is that rustic language or language of ordinary people is a language of poetry, is one of the important things. Now, another thing that has to be noted is that we could sort of juxtapose Wordsworth's theory and Wordsworth's poem, one of Wordsworth's poems, for example. And when Wordsworth presents poetry as a spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings arising from emotions recollected in tranquility, we have to sort of go back to the central, the crucial elements of Romanticism, nature and subjectivity and the individual experience. Let's just sort of for a moment go to Wordsworth's definition of a poet. I know it's a long quote, but then later to discuss Eliot also, we would need this, so I'd like to quote it. A poet is not a man in an ivory tower, nor is he the singer of the great. He is a man speaking to men, a man, it is true, endowed with more lively sensibility, more enthusiasm and tenderness, and a more comprehensive soul than are supposed to be common among mankind. A man pleased with his own passions and volitions, and who rejoices more than other men in the spirit of life that is in him, attempting to contemplate similar volitions and passions as manifested in the goings on of the universe. The point is, what it simply says is the poet, again, obviously, the central nuance of all this is divinity, nature, oneness, all of that, but experience of the poet and a sudden, a spontaneous recreation of that experience for the delight of the readers. Like, for example, I know everybody would know the daffodils, so let me just go to the daffodils. You see that I wandered lonely as a cloud that floats hills and hills, when all at once I saw a crowd, a host of golden daffodils. So you see, like, it's very visual. Like it is that poet's experience, and anyone who listens to the poem, like it sort of recreates it. So that is now. So these are some of the central ideas: rustic language, prose, making it closer to ordinary speech, making everybody able to understand without any ornate elements. And then we have Coleridge. Now, coming to Coleridge's Biographia Literaria, published in 1817. We can see that Wordsworth and Coleridge did have similar views initially, but later we see that obviously Coleridge's emphasis is on imagination, and This is where I'd like to briefly mention um, Coleridge, the distinction between primary and secondary imagination that Coleridge makes. Primary imagination is something that everybody has, and then secondary imagination is something that poets in particular possess. And then the word that he used was assemblastic. Imagination is a shaping power. For example, we can see, say, for example, Kubla Khan, we see that a damsel with a dulcimer. Let me just sort of look at that. I might go wrong there. So, a damsel with a dulcimer in a vision once I saw. So we see that Wordsworth is talking about what is right in front of his eyes. And then we see Coleridge, it's a damsel with a dulcimer in a vision once I saw. It was an Abyssinian maid, and on her dulcimer she played, singing of Mount Abora. Could I revive within me her symphony and song, to such a deep delight would win me. So the point is, what I'm trying to say, it's something that's more mundane, it's something more imaginative. So um so this is I know I'm trying to sort of give you bits and pieces of all of these, but what I'm trying to do is to sort of give you like a slice of all of these and to present, to sort of introduce you to the to the stream of the discourse. So you have Wordsworth and Coleridge, and then and also Coleridge came to disagree completely with the view that the language of poetry must try to become more like the language of prose. So he, again, the emphasis on imagination and aesthetic effect. Like to come to Shelley's A Defense of Poetry, published in 1821. Now, it's really fascinating to see how Shelley sort of talked about critics later called defamiliarization. To put it very simply, it means imagination, how imagination transforms what is familiar to something that is unfamiliar. So it's really interesting how he sort of even anticipated the use of the term like way in advance. So it's also interesting to think of how Shelley spoke about poetry and poets, the zeitgeist, knowing about the spirit of the era, and how does poets relate to those of other poets. And it's also interesting to see how Peter Barry, for instance, sort of talks about, isn't that somewhere what Eliot talks much later when he talks about the idea of the historical sense. I'll come to that shortly, but anyway, so this is the crux of it about how poetry strips the wheel of familiarity from the world, and compels to feel that which we perceive and imagine. So again, what I'm trying to say is, you have Wordsworth, emphasis on simple language, and then about nature, subjectivity, and then you have Coleridge, imagination, distinction between primary and secondary imagination is elastic and shaping power. And then we have Shelley, where we talk about the spirit of the era, and then how it connects to other poems. Defamiliarization. Defamiliarization, I know, is a term which was discussed much later by Russian critics. But then again, the idea of transforming what is familiar to unfamiliar through imagination. The next bit is where I'll briefly mention Eliot now, but I will come to it a bit later. I'll just briefly mention Eliot here. Now, again, Eliot's idea, obviously, three of Eliot's most important ideas: the dissociation of sensibility. To put it very simply, it means separating thought from feeling. Then you have impersonality theory, which I would like to explain. And then comes the idea of the objective correlative. These are the three different ideas. I will explain it in a while. And so the central idea is, what Eliot did is to advocate a separation between the poet who experiences, the person who experiences it, and the poet who writes about it. So this is how we see that difference between romanticism and modernism. When we juxtapose, this becomes super clear when we juxtapose Wordsworth and Eliot. Now, Wordsworth writes poetry is a spontaneous overflow, powerful feelings arising from emotions recollected in tranquility. And we have Eliot, who says poetry is not about spontaneity, it is not about recollection, it is a concentration, and a concentration resulting from experiences which need not be experiences for others. So what is important is that on one side, Eliot talks about spontaneity. This is his own experience, and you have Eliot talking about Eliot's central idea is that it's not really, as you might know from the essay "The Tradition and the Individual Talent," published in 1919. It's really what how the poet is able to transcend his own experience with his sense of tradition. I will come to that again. Let me just sort of Wordsworth, Coleridge, um, and Shelley. Now, let me. Oh, I'm really sorry about this. I forgot to mention about Keats. Dear of negative capability. So Wordsworth, Coleridge, Shelley, and Keats come together. So I'm really sorry about that. But again, this idea of negative capability. To make it very simple for you, I would like to say what negative capability would be. To put it very simply, you have, let's just go back to Coleridge and willing suspension of disbelief. That is when, as a reader, you're ready to, for example, let me just quote Coleridge. Coleridge says, that sunny dome, those caves of ice, sunny dome and caves of ice, sun and ice. So you're, as a reader, you should be ready to suspend there. But and then about negative capability, which would be like to sort of, as a writer, when a writer is comfortable, I guess the definition of negative capability goes like being comfortable in mysteries and uncertainties. So I'd sort of say negative capability, the way I interpret it, is writer willingly and consciously suspends that emphasis on rationality and is comfortable in mysteries and uncertainties. So that's it there, the romantic theories, romantic critical theories and romanticism, Wordsworth, Coleridge, Shelley, and Keats. But again, it has to be noted that Keats did not really theorize it the way Shelley or Wordsworth or Coleridge did, but clear in his letters, where he talks about his views on this, like, for example, negative capability. So yeah, so that is that. And then coming to Eliot, in personality and historical sense, the sense of tradition, again, knowing anyone who's really confused about Eliot, to put it very simply, historical sense means what works of the past, how things have evolved, and what things are at the moment. Basically, an understanding of the past and an understanding of the present. And important is, like, for example, let me just make it easier for you. When we're talking about, let's say, Shakespeare's works in the 16th century, have theories on post-colonialism and ABC then. So, but now we have post-colonial readings of Shakespeare or new later ideas. So the central idea is the past influences the present and the present influences the past. So we have post-colonial readings of Shakespeare. So new ideas influence the old, and old ideas pave way for the new ones. So that is historical sense. Impersonality simply means I'm a poet. Something happened in my life and I'm writing about it. But the central idea would be, it's not really about my experience that matters, but how do I articulate it, through my poetry, and readers being able to understand that without knowing anything about my life. So that's basically impersonality. The person who speaks it as distinct from the person who writes about. That's basically in personality theory. I've already sort of hinted at dissociation of sensibility. That's basically separating thought and feeling. Impersonality is this, and objective correlative. Now, what is objective correlative? Again, it's a very simple idea. What it simply means is you're using symbols, or you're using concrete gestures, or concrete symbols to articulate an abstract idea. That is objective correlative. Is it very clear?
Yes, ma'am, it's clear.
Are you able to connect to all of these? Because I don't want to sort of talk about a lot of theories and leave you with nothing. I would rather have you interact and understand and, like engage with it. Does anyone like to say anything? So I'll continue. Um, yeah, so I think I sort of, the way I had structured my notes, they sort of mentioned Eliot because of the reference to Shelley. I've sort of messed up the chronology that way, but let me just summarize it again. Wordsworth, Coleridge, Shelley, and Keats. And why I came to Eliot now is of the parallel that Peter Barry discusses about Shelley and Eliot. But anyway, I also discussed it there because it's easier to I also did that to juxtapose romanticism because it's so much easier to understand it there. I'm sorry, but the chronology wise, it goes like from whatever I've talked about: Aristotle's Poetics, Sidney's Apology of Poetry, which is where we talk about the instruction. Most importantly, literature as a source of pleasure. Poets, Apology for Sidney's Sidney. Then we have Wordsworth, Coleridge, Shelley, and Keats, and then it's Victorian critics. I only mentioned Eliot along with romanticists only to make the distinction clear. After the Romantic critics, you have Victorian critics, where we'd be talking about Matthew Arnold, Henry James. See, again, I've sort of referred Peter Barry mainly because this is I'm supposed to introduce it and I did not want to complicate it. But I'm very aware of the contradictions, the arguments that I'm making, because to make it easier to understand here, Peter Barry between sort of he says that there are two different tracks of English criticism, of which the first one is where we talk about Samuel Johnson, Matthew Arnold, T.S. Eliot, and F.R. Lewis. And then we have the other one is where we talk about Sidney and Wordsworth and Coleridge and George Eliot and Henry James. Basically, what we're trying to see is there is a divide between text-led criticism. I'll tell you what it is: text-led criticism and more of an ideological approach. Now, very simply, what we're trying to say is text-led approach means you read the text and only the text. So practical criticism is a British term, like it's a term which was used in Britain, and new criticism is the American counterpart. Text-led approach is when you read the text, you're not looking at the history, you're not looking at anything else. The text, what does the text say? That is the text-led approach. And then you have the ideology, all of this. I'm not going into that because our topic is practical criticism. Now, from this track, we're talking about Samuel Johnson, Matthew Arnold, T.S. Eliot, and F.R. Lewis. Let me go to Victorian critics. So this is the chronology. I'm talking about practical criticism in general. Wordsworth, Coleridge, Shelley, Byron, Keats, and then you have Victorian critics, which is where you have Matthew Arnold as a central figure. And this is, and he's a canonical figure in the history of English criticism. And this is also because of the fact that in the 20th century, F.R. Lewis adopted and adapted a lot of his ideas. Now, with Matthew Arnold, what is also important is that, remember the way we talked about how Sydney did? Sydney said literature is a source of pleasure. Now, for Matthew Arnold, literature was actually a substitute for religion. So, and this is also because, what will happen in the 19th century. So, primarily, what he felt was the middle classes had the burden and responsibility of democracy, but what happened was they were all debased by materialism and philistinism. So what Matthew Arnold felt was that, okay, literature will instill values in people. So literature, he thought of literature as a substitute for religion. Two important works are to be mentioned here: The Function of Criticism of the Present Time and The Study of Poetry. Now, what is important is the term that he used is disinterested, quote unquote, disinterested. Now, what it means is what he said is, quote, the object as in itself it really is. Now, what that means is you look at the text and what does the text say? It is quote unquote disinterested in that it does not really look at the wider historical other factors. It looks at the text. Now, central to the discourse, the touchstone method. Now, what is a touchstone? Touchstone is basically what you use to try gold. So what Matthew Arnold meant is, you have to look at the canonical works, the important works, and then you use them for to measure and to assess today's works. So that is touchstone method. Basically, you look at the important works, the works of the past, and then you think, okay, then you measure and analyze, okay, what were the works then, what are the works now, what is the quality. It's for comparison analysis. So it's important to note, from Shelley we see this, like Shelley talks about how does the spirit of the era, how does the poem connect to other poems of the era. There's a connection between other poems and all of that. And then with Matthew Arnold, also touchstone, going back to older important works and assessing literature of today. So you see that persistent link, that persistent reference to a connection between the past and the present. And then comes the 20th century, and this is where I'd like to talk about F.R. Leavis, T.S. Eliot, William Emerson, and I.A. Richards. We know that except for Eliot, who was at Harvard, others were at the English school, and then the powerful influence it had on the teaching of English worldwide in the 1970s. So then I've already discussed Eliot's most important ideas. Dissociation of sensibility, impersonality, and the objective correlative. Does anybody like me to sum up? Does anybody want me to sum up Eliot's central ideas? Because Eliot is really important. Everyone is equally important. But anyway, also because I'm really by Eliot's theories. If anybody would like me to sum it up, I can do that.
Yes, ma'am, if you could please.
Yeah, so again, the essay begins with a discussion of what historical sense is. I've already made it very simple for you, knowing how works have changed over time. What is it now? That's historical sense. Historical sense, quote, is an awareness of the pastness of the past and of its present. So works of the past, how things have evolved, how does it connect to the works of the present? That is historical sense. Now, the second idea is impersonality. I've already explained that. It just means there is a distinction between the person who experiences it and the person who writes about it. And then he also talks about poetry as a living whole of all poetry that has ever been written. This is where it's also important to note how Eliot debunks Wordsworth's theories of poetry, and the central idea is that poetry is not about spontaneity. It is a concentration. So basically what he says is that your experiences, your knowledge, everything stays in your mind till goes into a quote new combination. So that's basically what he says. And then he reiterates the central idea, which is knowing works of the past, how things have evolved, what is it at the moment. So that's to present Eliot's central ideas in The Tradition and the Individual Talent of 1919. And then coming to yeah, now I would like to come to talk about, just mention FR levers, because I'm just introducing all of these concepts. I'll just sort of talk about FR levers. Now, FR levers, as I've said, is an important, as I've already mentioned, that he has adapted and adopted many of Matthew Arnold's ideas. And it has to be noted that was also very, he would sort of analyze works of masters like Dante and all of them. And but again, it's very debatable. But anyway, what he did was to take the practice of close reading. I'll explain it. Close reading to a greater level, and then, but then it is interesting how he avoided the use of critical terms. He doesn't use any critical terminology, and say, for example, he used simple words, common words like life, to talk about his concepts, to discuss his concepts. And it is also interesting to see how levers, FR levers, was thought of as a rebirth of Johnson and Arnold, and how he's sort of brought together and moralism of Johnson and Matthew Arnold's social vision. Now, I would like to sort of talk about William Emerson, William Emerson, I. Richards, William Emerson, and especially. So here, let me just introduce it, and then I'll use the slides to discuss this further. Now, William Emerson and I. Richards, they used the method of, they actually pioneered the technique of close reading, the text-led extreme criticism. And then, so what it simply did is to close read text. Close read means I'll explain it in a minute. And then, so basically, it is I.A. Richards who was the pioneer of the decontextualized approach to literature, which became popular in between the 1930s to the 1970s. So in Britain, it came to be known as practical criticism. In America, it came to be known as new criticism. So it is important to mention John Crow Ransom, who was the person who made it popular in the United States with the publication of his eponymous book. Eponymous book means the title of the book is the same, New Criticism. And then let me just use like a couple of slides to talk about it. Yeah. So yeah. So yeah. So now, what do I mean by close reading? Close reading means you're looking at, it's really important to think of the way we do poetry for our class, right? We look at read the sat is it, which I think is the most ridiculous way of reading a poem. So here, what practical criticism does is to read it word by word. You read it at the syntactic level, you read it the grammatical unit, the words, how does it sound, what does it say, what does it say, how does it say it. You're basically reading it very, very closely. You're analyzing every single detail, and you're not really looking at the historical and or other factors. You're looking at the text and only the text. That's basically close reading. It's very simple. The formal elements as well as the linguistic elements. I'll come to that. Formal and linguistic elements. And now this is also known as intrinsic or objective criticism. Intrinsic because it's within the text, right? And objective criticism because it's empirical. And then I'll come to the most important books. Primarily, I'm talking about the first generation. So here, it's the most important works are Eliot's tradition and the individual talent, and Hamlet and other problems. Then you have I.A. Richards' practical criticism of 1929, and you also have William Emerson's Seven Types of Ambiguity. Look at and then it's also important to look at how the new critical or the practical critical approach underscores a unique and a universal theme, which is timeless, and it also avoids historical and biographical information. And I'd also like to talk about the decline. It declined after a period with the rise of theories like reader response and new historicism and cultural studies. I've already discussed Eliot. Now let me just briefly discuss practical criticism by I.A. Richards. Now, what it says is, when we look at a text, we look at what is the sense, what is the literal meaning of a poem. I'll explain this. What is the simple, what does the text say, what is the literal meaning, what are the feelings of the poem, what are the feelings that it communicate, what is the tone, is it formal, is it informal, uh, is it jovial, is it sad, what is the tone of the poem, intention. Now this is where we can talk about sort of like also in terms of psychoanalysis, but again, is it a conscious, does the poet say something intentionally, or is it something that was an unintended meaning? And then you look at, now central to the discourse is also the significance of the context, because the central idea is that, see, when a poet writes, right, the poet is trying to communicate something. And because language is the medium, language or words are the medium of communication, we have to understand words in depth. But the problem is that words, the same word has different meanings, so that complicates it. So then so that way it results in ambiguity. Now William Emerson talks about it extensively. Ambiguity simply means a verbal difficulty, because you have multiple meanings, because you have because it's self-contradictory sometimes, because it's sometimes it's metaphorical, it sort of, it can have many meanings, and then you wonder which meaning is important to me. So then the solution then becomes, you put it in a context. In what context are you using the term? Then you talk about the value of metaphor again. See, for example, um, the problem is that, like, for example, we use metaphorical terms like the crown or things like that. So then, are you talking about the literal meaning, or are you talking about the metaphorical meaning, and how that sort of complicates it? Poetic truth simply means, it's not really the empirical, the intellectual truth, but what does a poem communicate to you? That's a poetic truth. Now I would like to just briefly talk about, so always keep in mind the three important authors, from Eliot, and tradition and the individual talent, and the other one, um, Hamlet and Other Problems, and William Emerson, Seven Types of Ambiguity. Anthony will discuss this in depth. I'll just very briefly talk about the seven types of ambiguity that he talks about. Ambiguity simply means having more than one meaning, and that way causing verbal difficulty. And the first ambiguity is when a sentence is effective in several ways at once. For example, okay, I think, see, the problem with me giving examples is that it's an introductory session, and this text is, it sort of takes a close reading to an extreme that it sort of complicates it, which is why I'd like to refrain from going in depth into it. I'll just briefly mention the seven types of ambiguity. Anthony will elaborate on this. When a word is effective, when it has multiple meanings at once, that is the first one. The second ambiguity is two or more alternative meanings are resolved into one. He will explain it. The third one is when you have two unconnected meanings in one word, the two unconnected meanings. Third one is alternative meanings are combined to show a state of mind. Then fifth one is a fortunate confusion, or the author discovering his idea in the act of writing. The sixth one is when a sentence says something irrelevant and to make an interpretation out of it. When there is a complete contradiction in the meaning, and that reflects a division in the writer's mind. Again, it's very convoluted. It's kind of nebulous. It's kind of so let's not go in depth into that, considering the fact that this is an introduction. And obviously, Professor Ampad Koshi and Dr. Anirudh Sridhar would talk extensively about it. I'm really really fortunate to join this session, because both of them were my mentors, are my mentors. That's how I started reading more about practical criticism. So no better people than no better scholars than them to talk about this to you. So now what I'd like to do is to talk about now you know what close reading is. When you read so closely that it's sort of sometimes it sort of obliterates the context and it looks so much at the text. And the two problems with this is that, one, the theoretical vacuum, the approach, the technique, it's not to choose one critique of the approach that Rene Willeck pointed out, especially in reference to William F.R. Lewis. And the other one is how it is poorly defined. And the second one is that it actually makes it too text bound, and it does not really look at anything else. So that way it's restrictive. And it declined in the 60s and 70s, but it's making a huge comeback at the moment. And I find this text by Derek Attridge and Henry Staten an absolutely wonderful read. And that's mainly because of the way it does not discredit or denigrate or debunk a new historicist stance completely. It acknowledges it. It acknowledges the significance of that approach, and also the possibility of the conjunction of the nuances of both new criticism and new historicism. So this is a great book. And again, I'm really grateful to Dr. Anirudh Sridhar. He's the one who introduced me to the book. And he was also editing a work with the authors of this book. So let me just give you an example of what I was talking about. I'm actually using the first chapter of the book, Minimal Interpretation by Derek Attridge and Henry Staten. And so what practical criticism does is to look at the poem at a very fundamental, at a very basic level. You're looking at the poem as a structure of grammatically formed and meaningful sound. So you're looking at the poem syntactically, temporally, and the rhythmic structure of the poem. See, so this is actually I've sort of taken it from the first chapter of the book. And so this is a poem, The Sick Rose by William Blake. And read the poem. Look at the poem, and you can see that, "Oh Rose, thou art sick." The first line has got two beats. So what a practical critic would do is to read word by word by word. You look at the syntax, you look at the comma, you look at the full stop, you look at the break, you look at the stanza. You look at word by word, and you look at, say, for example, rose. What did the word rose mean back in this, since its origin? And then you look at it linguistically. You look at it. You look at all the elements on the page, the words on the page. That is what you analyze, and then you can see, read this, and then I'll just show how they discuss it. Now, this poem is basically about a rose, and the rose, here it says that there is a vermin or a worm, and the vermin is eating it, which is a literal meaning of the poem. And the metaphorical poem is the metaphorical sense could be one of it could be that one of the interpretations could be that the rose is destroyed by the worm's dark secret love. Could be somebody being cheated in love. It's possible to numerous interpretations. So what it says is that the practical critical this approach sort of reads it as the rose is being destroyed by the worm's dark secret love. If we approach the poem at the level of what it means, so here what it does is that we're not really trying to understand what is the meaning of the poem as we usually do, but it tries to delve deeper into the poem, look at every single word, how is it presented. Like, for example, there is a full stop, there is a long pause after the first line of the poem. This is called a pregnant pause. Pregnant pause is something that sort of builds up tension and then sort of goes into the next one. The line has got two beats, and then the reason why I'm not going into rhyme and meter and all of that is that it becomes a bit too complicated. And I'm sure that Dr. Ampat Koshi and Dr. Anirudh Sridhar would discuss it extensively. So I'm just giving you a basic introduction. You look at every single word, how is it arranged from the first line through the second line, and then how is a poem, how does a poem appear on the page, how does it show what it tries to say, all of that. How does the word sound? Rose Tawatsik, what sounds are recurrent, what sounds are dominant, all of that. And not really only at the meaning, but you're looking at the formal features as well. See, for example, one line, it has got two beats, there is a pregnant pause, there is an enjambment, and then so you're looking at all of these aspects. You look at how a poem structured. So all of these are the different ways in which practical critics would approach a text. And let me just talk about why is it important, why is it said that, why is there a big ruckus about practical criticism making a big comeback in the 20th century, in the 21st century. I think in conjunction with the ideological approach, like in conjunction with other theories, I think practical criticism helps us to delve deeper into the text, helps us to engage with the text at a more deeper level. Like I think I've always found it ridiculous to do poetry in class. Like you read Wordsworth or whoever, like you read the summary of the poem and write that in the answer sheet, and that's it, because you're not really talking about the feeling of the poem. How does it show? How does it say? What does it sound like? How does it appear on the page? What is a rhyme? What is a meter? I think there's so much more to a poem. Like there's so much more to engage with it, and I'm in no way trying to discredit the importance of the ideological approach. I do really absolutely love theories, but I think both are important. The new critical and the new historicist approaches would sort of a whole picture of engaging with the text. It sort of gives us a deeper understanding of the text, and a lot of wider issues also, I guess. So thank you so much, everyone. I hope I could give you a good introduction to the history and where things are at the moment. And Anthony would elaborate on a lot of concepts that I've merely introduced. So,
Thank you for the insightful lecture, ma'am. Now, I think it's the time for the Q&A session. And due to the time constraints, we will be filtering the questions and group those of similar nature. So the participants can post their questions in the chat box of the YouTube channel, and we will read out the questions for you, ma'am.
All right.
Hello, Parvati. Can you just tell me how relevant is this close reading nowadays? Because we have come to a period of multiple readings, multiple renderings. So, is it necessary that you need to have a thing called close reading?
Yes, I strongly think so, because I know this has always been perceived of as a very elitist and or a limited approach, but I do, to sort of talk about it historically, I think in the past, the problem with practical criticism was that it sort of looked at itself as the only form of criticism that was ever possible. But I think it is relevant because um, poems, I think I'm quite a modernist in that way, I guess. But I think every poem, every work has a life of its own, and I think the syntactical and or the other attributes are equally important. Also in terms of language and literature, semantics obviously And I think a deeper understanding of the structure and the formal attributes would also facilitate a deeper understanding of the semantic aspects as well. And I mean, could you sort of repeat the question for me?
My question is, how relevant is practical criticism nowadays? Because so many changes have come in. It seems so archaic, so one-sided, so a kind of colonial backup is behind it, because you are more to the grammatical side than to the reading and enjoyment of the poem.
Um, See, I think I can sort of break it down into several aspects, but I think the colonial aspect of it, I think I'm sort of confused a bit. Um, could you once more repeat that question for me?
How relevant is
Thinking about some
practical
answer.
criticism? How relevant
How
is practical
okay,
criticism
yeah,
nowadays?
so I had something in mind, yeah, so it sort of slipped my mind, that's why I asked you to repeat it. I think one thing is, as a student, this is what I've felt, and I resonate deeply with what Henry Seaton and Derek Attridge writes initially, that we're always taught to learn so much about poem and poetry and literature without even being trained to read something properly. And as a student, I feel that um, we need to learn to read, just looking at the content, sort of makes us. I think this actually helps us to become better readers, and also to think critically also, like how does it say what it says. um, I think it helps us to understand. One thing is the way, like, look at the way we do it in colleges, right? Like we read the summary and that is it. How many of us know how to appreciate a poem? How many of us know the meter and the rhyme and the way poems should be read, and to sort of look, even to reflect what is our understanding of a poem. Like, we're always asked to write about write about what is given in the guide, or what has been stereotypically understood as important, like what is the important point there in the poem to be written in the answer. But I think to be able to read for yourself and to reflect, and to, I would sort of go back to I.A. Richards, because even in terms of the, not to the extent of the psychological, because Aya Richard sort of talks about the psychological impacts of this, but I think it's about being able to read and think and to decipher for oneself. I think that's really important. I think that is one thing, and the other thing that I would like to see is, also because of the nuance of colonial bit that you said, I think the way I see it, it's not really. I would not advocate a new critical reading only, but then um, with certain elements of new historicism as well. So that way there is a balance between the semantical and the syntactical aspects, and then also to read critically. I think the certain techniques of practical criticism would help us to delve deeper into the content as well. So rather than making a distinction between semantics and syntax, I think there could be a mutual, I think it would mutually benefit it. A greater understanding of the syntax would also facilitate a deeper delving into the text, and hence a more understanding with the content as well. So yeah, that's what I think. And about the colonial bit, could you say that again? Hello.
This, isn't it?
I'm sorry.
Hello, can't you hear me?
Mm,
The English education that we enjoy in India
yeah, but yeah, I can hear you. I think I have a very
is
important.
colonial in its, because in Indian criticism we speak about aesthetics, how the feel of the poem is there,
Yeah.
how it
So
is done,
I think I
how
have.
we understand the thing. Hmm?
Mm,
Hmm. Yes, please continue. So if we deal about feeling the
I
thing,
think
why
in
should we cross examine to such level?
I think as a student who is, yeah.
Hmm.
could you say that again? If we,
Why should we take this because in India we were discussing earlier
in India we were discussing. Could you
lot
write that for
about
me,
the
because I could only hear till there.
Apu sir, your
traditional
voice is breaking.
sense.
Excuse me, sir.
I,
It's glitching a lot. Yeah, so here, before I get the, I couldn't hear that bit, but I guess because you said a bit about colonialism, I have something really important to say. As a student who has studied in both India and and in the UK, I know one thing. This distinction between colonialism and India, I think I find that very complicated, because see, when we're talking about colonialism, I think we should also talk about colonial modernity, right? Like, for example, when I was doing English literature, I did UG and PG. I did 5 years of British history. How many papers on Indian history did I do? I moved to the UK, and I think I think I had to read about case studies in Attapadi about literature, 20 works. For me, decolonizing is a very complicated concept, because I think we are way more Eurocentric than the curriculum here. So, not just within the context of practical criticism, I think is a problem. So I think we really have to rethink colonialism, and I think we should sort of delve deeper into how we consciously or unconsciously, implicitly and or explicitly perpetuate neocolonialism, I think. Yeah. Colonial modernity. Yeah. Hello. So I couldn't hear the question in relation to practical criticism. If you could send me the question, I would love to talk about it. Yeah.
Thank you, ma'am. You have a question from Anand Krishnamurthy. Shall I read it out?
Okay. Yeah.
Don't you think William Empson is too outdated? Isn't his concepts of ambiguity too stereotypical now to teach?
Mm, I think it depends. Uh, See, that everything could be argued for and against. Like, we could always pick certain aspects of a text and argue for and against. So, and yeah, so that's my answer. It depends. It depends on what argument you're trying to make, in what context, in relation to what. I think I do agree with the fact that I won't see, again, it depends on what are we analyzing and for what purpose. But I think the problem with Empson is I think he sort of takes a close reading to an extreme, where it sort of complicates it. But then but then again but then again, it depends on how you use it and what you make out of it and for what. So yeah,
Okay, ma'am.
it's too
Thank you.
hypocritical. I do agree with that.
Okay, ma'am. Ma'am, there is another question from Anand Krishnamurthy. Shall I read it out?
Okay.
If Eliot's historical
Yeah.
sense concept be taken into consideration, how would you practice it as a post-colonial subject studying in London?
Post-colonial subject studying in London. Could you read the question again?
Sure, ma'am. If Eliot's historical concept be taken into consideration,
Yeah.
how would you practice it as a post-colonial subject studying in London?
I think I can engage with the works of the past and the present. Yeah, in the sense that, yeah, I could sort of look at older British concepts. Yeah, again, so there are numerous ways of looking at it. It's too vast and it's so broad and it's exciting and it's also confusing, but it's really fascinating. like for example, if I'm talking about poetry, as a young poet from India who's writing, I could probably adopt certain whether it is certain stylistic attributes or say for example, let's say I like the form of this. See, there are numerous ways of answering this question. It's such a brilliant question, I think. But I can't even, explain, but I can give you one example. I can sort of take say for example, as a poet, I could take the sonnet, and then maybe I know Dr. Ampat Koshi, the way he has done it. Like for example, you have the sonnet, and look at the way Ampat sir has actually come up with the Rossiet sonnet. Like he introduced another dimension of it. He introduced a technique. He perfected a technique. The same way I could use I could think of older concepts, British concepts, and discuss them in relation to the Indian context. Like, for example, I think last week when I was doing one of my assignments, I think because I have too many assignments, I'm thinking which one was it? I had to write on a paper. I had to write a paper on some British. Yeah, say for example, intersectionality and feminism, intersectional feminism in Britain. So I think so. Like for example, they were actually talking about British feminism, da da da, and trying to sort of present, propagate it as internationalized feminism, and then I actually but how can you internationalize it, because it doesn't really resonate with the concerns of third world women the same way. I think I've made it way too complicated, but the point is I can take British and adopt an appropriate and also I can sort of compare and contrast in a way that it would enrich either or both, whether it is in terms of poetry. I can use the reason why I joined for a course here the masters is to acquaint myself with the methodologies, and then sort of look at the Indian context. Like for example, I'm very keen on studying gender as an analytical category. I'm sort of looking at all the Western methodological frameworks to look at, say for example, the exposure of women in Kerala to liberal anyway Western attitudes and theories. Say for example, with the proliferation of the internet, we are introduced to a very free society, which we don't have because of the fact that we are confined to a very patriarchal society. So so the thing is, um, I could sort of talk about the connections and distances between Western theory and Indian theories, and the problem with internationalizing certain concepts and theories. Where is that problematic? I can also use our theories to point out and to enrich the limitations of their theories, not just in terms of theories, in terms of criticism, in terms of poetry. I could adapt and appropriate certain forms in Britain to sort of enrich our cauldron, or vice versa. I mean, numerous possibilities. I am very passionate about reading and writing and literature and criticism, and I think for me, then it becomes a complex. Should I think of it as an aspiring poet? Should I think of it as an aspiring scholar? Should I think of it as an aspiring academician? Should I think of it as a very, yeah, like it's really fascinating. Yeah.
Thank you, ma'am. There is another question by Madhavi S. Shall I read it out?
Yeah. Yeah.
How is decontextualized approach in postmodern literature relevant? And she would also like to know more about Richard's view on it.
Could you say the first bit? What is it?
How is
Decontext.
decontextualized approach in postmodern literature relevant?
Decontextualized approach. Decontextualized approach is when you do not look at the context, you look at the text and only at the text. I'm afraid I've never really thought much about it, and I would also be very honest about the fact that this is not my area of expertise. But I would really look into it, and I would get back to you on that. So yeah.
Thank you, ma'am. We have another
Yeah.
question from Thomas Mattapallil. How far the practical criticism on culture
Yeah.
geography is studied in literature?
I'm afraid I am new to these concepts because I'm more of a scholar of gender and gender theory. But this I've done this before, but my understanding of it is very is limited. But I'm very confident about the introduction that I could give. Since also because I was asked to prepare the introduction, I think Anthony or Dr. Ampad Koshi or Dr. Anirudh Sridhar would be able to talk more about it than I could. So I acknowledge my limited knowledge. Thank you. But could you please send in both the questions to me? I would love to read on it and get back to you on that. I will certainly write to you. So, yeah.
Thank you, ma'am. You have another question from Dr. Apu Jacob John. How will you apply
Yeah.
practical criticism in your own poems?
Um, Practical criticism to my own poems. In terms of, I think I've always wanted to acquaint myself. I've always wanted to learn more about meter and rhyme. So maybe it could be that in terms of the syntax, like probably start um, experimenting with meter and rhyme, in and even in terms of, I think, not just as a writer, even the way I read it, which words to emphasize, even in terms, like, the way you do practical criticism, right? The first one would be to sort of close read the key terms. The second one would be to understand the recurrent patterns, like whether it is in terms of rhyme and meter or the word or the sounds. I think first one would be in terms of the keywords, you know, the whether it is using devices like alliteration or even all of these text, all of these attributes like irony, or so many aspects, paradox, and so many other aspects. So I think as a poet, I could experiment with rhyme and meter, the way I structure words on page, the sound, the words and how they sound, and also how does what words do I use and how do they facilitate a presentation of like a visual. I'm always keen on that, like, how can I use words to facilitate a visual, very overtly visual depiction of what I'm talking about. That Also I'd like to look at, I'm very fascinated, I'm really excited to use, I'm really fascinated by the use of the recurrence of consonants and vowel sounds. I'm really interested in, obviously, metaphors, puns, obviously puns. Yeah, all of these, so many attributes. So yeah.
Thank you, ma'am. There's another question. It's from Amita
Yeah.
Vinod. Is the
Mm-hmm.
studies on practical criticism in India and US different in any manner? Isn't the method of studying criticism be changed?
See, honestly, as a former student of literature, I've done theory, all of these, but again, my focus was always on gender. But since I write and I'm keen on, like, practical criticism, to read how, practical critics work. I read Ampad Koshi sir's works like all the time. I'm very keen on that. But I think as a scholar, I my knowledge of practical criticism in India and the US is very limited. I know about John Crow Ransom and obviously much later Cleanth Brooks and the criticism and all that. But I think my knowledge is very limited to comment on any of these. And since I'm really passionate about it, and was asked only to give an introduction, I was really excited to do that. But I think you should ask this question to Dr. Ampad Koshi, because his knowledge on not just practical criticism literature, world literature itself is incredible, and I think he will be able to give you the best answer ever. I'm really sorry, but I'm really, really not the right person to talk extensively on this. Yeah. So
Thank you, ma'am. There is another question from Sandra and Sunil. How do you think
mm,
that the literary criticism approach contribute to graphic design?
Literary. See, literary criticism approach. Is it practical criticism?
Literary criticism approach.
Literary criticism approach. In literary criticism, is that a reference to practical criticism? So I think what does practical criticism say? You read the works on the page, and you analyze it for yourself without the intervention of anything that is external to the text. So in that way, what would you like me to talk about? Criticism, literary criticism, and
Approach, how to contribute to graphic design.
um I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I don't know about it. So yeah. Honestly, I'm also a student, and I don't want to give you vague answers and project my naive views on anything. If I'm clueless about it, I would rather be very honest about what I don't know and also try to learn about it. So yeah, I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I'm unable to talk about it. So yeah.
Okay, thank you, ma'am. That was the end of the Q&A session. And
May I take a moment to
yes, ma'am.
request you to
Yes,
send
yes.
in all the questions to me, because as a student I'm startled and I'm also excited to learn about all of these questions, because I've never thought about any of these. Thank you so much for questions like this, and thank you so much, everyone. Feel free to point
Thank you,
out
ma'am.
mistakes or corrections or additions if there are any. So yeah.
Sure, ma'am. Thank you. We have come to the end of our first session, and we begin with the second session. May I invite Mr. Anthony Jose? Over to you, sir.
Yes, you can see me and I'm audible. Am I? Can anybody confirm
Yes, sir,
that?
you are audible.
you're
Yes, sir, you are audible.
Okay. First of all, let me begin by using this opportunity to place on record my sincere gratitude to CMS College, English Department, CMS College, and all of the people who have worked uh, behind in organizing this, 3-day practical criticism workshop. And a special thanks to dear Dr. Apujikab John, who have invited me for this. Uh, okay, let's begin. I was actually fascinated by the questions and the thoughts and thought processes that have influenced the previous session. So let me begin my session by touching upon a certain things that I think would be interesting for our journey throughout this, practical criticism workshop. First of all, the course director asked, the question that he posed is very valid. When you read a poem in isolation, does it make any sort of difference? Does it differ in any degree? And another thing that I would like to come back, I don't know the answer to that question, to be very frank, but let me try to answer that question in a different sense. HOD ma'am also mentioned about another critic, Matthew Arnold, whose name has been like resonant throughout this entire lecture. So Matthew Arnold is, a prominent critic in his own right. But what I would like to bring into your attention is his contribution to bringing literature and literary criticism more objective in terms of, as he himself calls it, seeing objects as they are. So he was a man who was kind of, you know, he used to deplore the current condition, I mean the 19th century condition of English society, because in England those days they were more a group of people whom I call as pragmatic, and they in France, the French people had a high regard for this word called curiosity. This is something that Arnold writes in his essays. Curiosity in French more or less means to explore, to find something new, to discover something that was unknown. But in England, there was this curious notion that curiosity is something childish, something that is only for the children. So without having this backdrop, without having this philological analysis, how you would understand this particular thing where Arnold tries to Arnold is asking you to see the things as it is, and make criticism more privileged than creative faculties. So without having this knowledge of philological understanding, how would you understand this? This is a question that I would like to pose in return, as if you will. So this is something that I want my listeners to ponder as we go through this lecture, or this discussion, I would rather say. So before beginning my session, I would also like to mention a couple of things, like at the beginning of the session, we have already listened to the couple of things that you would like to keep in mind to make this smooth. So these are my suggestion to my listeners. First of all, I'm not a practical critic. My allegiance lies somewhere else, as a matter of fact. Secondly, I would be mentioning both practical criticism and new criticism synonymously, because without looking at the other side of the Atlantic, it's impossible for me to bring into a synthesis of what practical criticism means. Third, it's the title of what, at least as it was printed in the the poster, is a bit I should say misleading, because first of all, a theoretical explanation of practical criticism is more or less impossible, because the term practical criticism involves a kind of an anti-theoretical sense. I would like to also add that that title was something that I myself wrote, but this is something that I realized later. So it's kind of a self-criticism, by the way. So practical criticism more or less involves an anti-theoretical approach, because the current meaning that we associate with theory does not come until the beginning of the the 1960s, 1950s, and the early 60s. So that's kind of different. When I say I'm going to theoretically look, what I mean is I'm going to have a canonical survey of what it actually means. Okay, having mentioned those 3 points, let me begin my session. All right, literary criticism and the criticism of literature are 2 different things. First of all, first things first. The entire, the history of entire literary criticism could be we could actually thank one person for the existence of what we now call as the literary criticism. That was Plato, who discovered that in his Republic, he could not tolerate the poets. Those people are, poems are unreliable source of truth, says Plato. And according to him, they need to be banished. And from then onwards, we have a bunch of people, not a bunch of people, in fact, there are lots and lots of people who came forward to answer that criticism of Plato. The first person was his own disciple, Aristotle, who tried to, as Parvati mentioned, to postulate a theory of literature which is more or less pragmatic. With that word being mentioned, I'd like to, also mention one more other thing. That there are several methods through which you can understand and learn literary theory and literary criticism as a whole. The one thing that I was fascinated with, there's a reason that I'm mentioning all this, you'll understand it later, is an approach developed by M.H. Abrams in his book, The Mirror and the Lamp. In that book, Abrams mentions 3 kinds of methods, 3 kinds of approaches wherein we can classify literary theory, literary criticism. Let me make myself more clear. Literary criticism. So the methods are, okay, before stating the methods, let me put this thing into your mind. Think of a work, okay, imagine this. A work is at the center, and you have three branches originating from the work. One of them connects the work to the universe, which is it is trying to imitate, and another branch connects the work to the author, and the third branch connects the work to the audience. And according to Abrams, there is also a fourth method possible. There's also fourth. We could not call it a branch because it's not a branch. The fourth method involves a sort of an objective method wherein you look the work in itself. We have, with respect to the first branch that I've mentioned, the work which is the branch that connects the work to the universe. With that respect, we have the pragmatic critics like Aristotle. With the branch, reference to the branch that connects the work with the author, we have expressive theorists like the Romantics. With reference to the branch that connects the work to the, what is that? Yeah. Branch, audience. Okay, I got a little confused myself. Branch, audience. Okay, with the audience, you have the pragmatic critics. With respect to the branch that connects to the author, you have the expressive critics. Why I'm mentioning this, you might think, because all of these three methods have been explored by the people who came before the 20th century, especially the Romantics and the neo-Aristotelians. So the perfect method for the new critics to present themselves as a unique form of literary criticism was to adopt an objective method. And I'll tell you in a moment why they have done it. And let me make it clear that I'm going to present this analysis in a canonical, in a non-new critical way, I would rather say. So why are we talking about this practical criticism? First of all, why did it came into existence? Okay. First of all, in the 19th, literary criticism exists, at least in my opinion, in two levels. One level, it is a response to the people like Plato, to the people who accuses literature is worthless. On the second level, it responds to the previous generation of literary critics. Think of how the Romantics responded to the Neoclassicists, how the Arnoldians responded to the Romantics, just like that. So, and there are general and specific ways of responding to a particular school of criticism. Say, for example, Parvati has mentioned, Sidney's defense of poetry. Sidney wrote that poetry to answer Plato's criticism as well as to answer the criticism of another person, specifically Stephen Goshen, who wrote an essay titled "School for Scandals." Poetry is a school for scandal, by the way. That's what he said. So he wanted to answer both criticism at once. That's why he wrote. That's why he said literary criticism is both specific and general at the same time. So coming back to the practical critics, what generally happens is that with the beginning of the 20th century, there was this immense faith in what we now call as positivism. There is a prominent school of thought. Cultural studies like emerging dominant culture, emerging culture, residual culture, but to put it simply, there will be one that is dominant, one that is at the top. There will be one that is emerging, kind of coming up, and the one that has lost its position. One that has lost its significance. So during the time of Matthew Arnold and the Victorians, it was mainly the emergence of science and Darwinism and all that comes with it. But with the 20th century, what happens is positivism, with the technology, with the belief in rational society. It was not only the people who belonged to the scientific discipline who subscribed to this notion. There was also people like H.G. Wells, pure men of letters, who believed that, you know, science could actually turn things around and help us to discover what we are. So there was also men of letters who subscribed to this notion. So along with it, the problem, you might think, what's the problem with that? It's a positive thing. It's a positive thing. What's the problem with that? The real problem with positivism is that it held the belief that progress, rationality could assure, progress and rationality could assure a new era of happiness wherein value would give way for facts, internal emotions to the external, and finally, private to the public. It could turn things around. That's what positivism believed in. And secondly, again, it's not big of a deal. Facts are much more important than emotions at times, we could say. By the way, if my audio gets, unclear or something like that, it would be appreciated if somebody could mention that to me and I could adjust that, because I had this issue throughout. When I was listening to Parvati, my audio was going in and out. So I don't know if it's my range issue or something. I don't know. So if something like that happens, I'd appreciate someone interrupting me and mentioning me. Okay, hope that's clear. So yeah. So where did I stop? Yeah, positivism. The subsequent thing, the consequence of positivism is that it strips, or it requires a language that is stripped of its elements like irony, paradox, metaphor, and other poetic devices. What they were saying is like, hey, look at this. We don't need a language that is slippery like a slippery staircase or something. What we need is a referential language, something like the the structuralists would say. We need a language that is more conform to the rules and regulations of society so that it makes some sense. That's where scientific people believe. So it was a kind of response. If you accept that particular ideology, what means is that no poetry. I mean, if you need poetry, you also need this kind of linguistic devices, poetic devices that that gives room for alternative responses, I would rather say. I'll come back to that quotation, which is something that I've taken from William Emerson. So I'll come back to that later. So if we accept that this ideology is correct and it has a ability, the death of literature. It was to this reality that the new critics or practical critics try to respond to. How they have done it is pretty interesting. Unlike the unlike the romantic people who also try to prove how literature is important by turning into themselves, by portraying literature as a self-expression, how as you see the thing, how as the poet sees the thing. The objective critics, the practical critics turned to the objective method, where they advocated a method that is removed from history and intentionality. That is intentional fallacy and objective fallacy. Those are essays written by W.K. Wimsett and Monroe C. PhD. They co-authored. So we'll come back to that essay. So what they did is that the new critics sought to construct a wall around literature, a separate space for literature, an aesthetic wall around literature that would preserve itself as a self-contained, I quote, self-contained, self-referential artifact. Whatever you need to interpret a poem is provided within the poem. You don't have to go out. That's what they're saying. And I would let me be, actually I've structured my lecture as this. I should have told this at the beginning, but then since I forgot to mention it, let me mention at least now. I'll be mentioning the major new critics, beginning from I.A. Richards. I'll step over for a moment across the Atlantic, John Crow Ransom and his major works, and I'll come back to British land with Client Brooks and W.K. Wimsett and those people. So let me actually try to bring out what I.A. Richards and the beginning of practical criticism meant. Practical criticism എന്ന ഒരു theoretical school നന്ദി പറയേണ്ടത് it's to two people whom we call as the precursors, both Arnold and T.S. Eliot. Arnold made the job of a critic more objective, and Eliot has brought that objectivity into poetic composition as well. That's what he did for his part. Parvati has also, already mentioned how Eliot brings out this distinction between the mind that suffers and the man that creates. This is an interesting quote. I like it. This is something that I often quote from Eliot. After Eliot, the guy who comes is I.A. Richards, who is actually an instructor, a teacher in Cambridge. So what he would do is he'd go to his class and circulate poems without any detail whatsoever, without the name of the author, without any backgrounds, historical information, and he'll ask his students to give him a response, their response to that particular poem. So let's look at what I.A. Richards meant by this, by looking at his writings. Okay. So I.A. Richards was the first person to realize this threat, this corroding threat of science and technology and rationalism and positivism to render poetry obsolete. And he called for a method that would separate poetry as a universe in its own. And in order to do this, what he did was he composed two terms. Okay. There was another term that he also kind of composed, but I'll come back to that later because he himself edited this, corrected this term. I.A. Richards is a guy who often corrects himself. He feels that what he has previously written was more like, doesn't make sense, and I correct myself. And what often happens is that sometimes he gets the chance to correct himself, and sometimes what happens is someone else beats him to the turf. So someone else goes ahead and publishes their version of, new criticism, which is exactly what, people like John Crow Ransom would do. I'll come back to that in a moment. So he coined these terms, intellectual belief and emotional belief, in his essay, Practical Criticism. The main works of I.A. Richards, by the way, to keep in mind, Principles of Practical Criticism, which is a book that was published, if my memory serves me right, in 1924. And again, there's another book called Practical Criticism, which he published in 1929. And there are a couple of other essays, one of which is pretty significant for us. We'll come back to that in a moment. Okay, so he coined this term, intellectual belief and emotional belief. Intellectual belief, according to Richards, occurs in a rational context of logical consistency, wherein it seeks as its end the fusion of all ideas into one. Okay, I'll repeat once again. The intellectual belief occurs in a rational context of logical consistency, where it seeks as its end the fusion of all existing ideas into a perfect unified system. So what do you mean by that? these are scientific statement. The you know the purpose of science is to combine all that we know, all that we have as facts, into pragmatic usable knowledge, into a perfect unified system where it will make meaning rather than being, അതായത് ചെറിയ ചെറിയ കഷ്ണങ്ങളായിട്ടുള്ള ഫാക്ട്സ് ആയിരിക്കുന്നതിന് പകരം യൂസബിൾ ആയിട്ടുള്ള നോളജ് ആക്കുക എന്നതാണ് റാഷണൽ, ഇന്റലക്ച്വൽ ടേംസിന്റെ മീനിങ് എന്നാണ് ഐറിച്ചസ് പറയുന്നത്. Now, that's what intellectual belief means. It's a scientific statement that seeks to fuse all ideas into one. I hope that's clear. Let me move to the other term. Emotional belief occur in an emotional context of feeling and sentiments, where its end is to solve ideas around our emotional needs and desires. He's specifically talking about the emotional beliefs, means the things that we use in poetry. These are emotional, it's ideas, its meaning is to fulfill our emotional needs and desires, he says, rather than uh, rather than fusing all ideas into one. And he also says, although emotional beliefs can be accompanied by intellectual beliefs, they often exist by themselves. They have an existence of their own. What he's saying is more or less poetry is emotional. This is like saying, answering to Plato, like Plato said that poetry is useless. It doesn't give any pragmatic value or whatever, truth value. This is like answering Plato, hey Plato, you don't have to look at this because you can't judge poetry with the rules of philosophy. That's what it is. Truth, pragmatism, all these things are more valid in philosophy than in poetry. Just like that. And this is what he sought to say through his works. And he also says, emotional beliefs are not verified by any external standard of coherence or coherence, but their success, they can only be measured by their ability in fulfilling our emotional needs and desires. That's what matters at the end of the day. So this is what I.A. Richards believed in, and this is exactly why he believed that you need, even when he went to his students, he did not ask his students, as far as I am concerned, I may be wrong, as far as I'm concerned, he did not ask his students to criticize his poems, criticize the poems that he's giving. He rather asked them, to give your response, your emotional response to the poem. That's what he said. And that's what led many of the people to call him a psychological critic, as Parvati mentioned. In fact, our next person, John Crow Ransom, criticizes Richards as a psychological critic. Okay, let's move to John Crow Ransom. And by this, let me also state that I would also like to answer one of the things that Apusa has asked. He raised this very significant question: aren't we just going back to colonial heritage by just reading these, only giving emphasis to this structure and not the feeling, those things? Let me answer that question by stepping across the Atlantic and going into another country, which was also like you can, if you want, call America a post-colonial nation. It has also its share of what we call as the colonial problems, colonial issues. John Crow Ransom, his main works are New Criticism published in 1941, for those who are like interested in dates and years. And another book which is very much important, The World's Body, published in 1937. This title is pretty significant. ഇവരുടെ മറ്റൊരു പ്രത്യേകത എന്ന് പറയുന്നത്, these guys have incredibly meaningful titles. ഇവർ ടൈറ്റിൽ ചെയ്യുന്നതും ഇവർ എഴുതുന്നതും വളരെ കണക്റ്റഡ് ആയിരിക്കും, കൊഹിയറൻ്റ് ആയിരിക്കും. I'll explain that in a moment. I'll explain why in a moment. Okay, to John Courant. In his essay, Criticism as Pure Speculation, he says, in that particular essay, he rejects every psychological and moral approaches to poetry. He says, what you need to do is to see the poetry as a thing in itself. He rejected all psychological and moral approaches to poetry in favor of an ontological status of poetry. I'll come back to that word. Let me come back to that word. Ontology. What is ontology? Ontology is the study of being. If you like, it's a pretty complicated term when you take into account what people like Heidegger and Derrida would speak a couple of decades later. But for our purposes and intentions, what John Courant means is that poetry is more or like an organic whole, a living being. You can't actually see the moral, the moral and psychological aspect. And he explains that he calls Richards a psychological critic, and he criticizes Richards for making too sharp a distinction between feeling-centered poetry and cold, unemotional science. This is like John Crow Ransom saying, hey, Richards, I've understood what you're saying. You're trying to make literature unique. But you know what the problem is? If you say that poetry is more or less emotional and science is cold, unemotional, more scientific, more rational, it'll be saying that, like, after a point, you can drop poetry from the radar. You can say, we don't need people who are emotional. We need people who can like think and act for themselves. So what John Crow Ransom is saying, no, this is not a correct way of saying it. He would say, okay, poetry is not an expression of emotion. Let's see what it is there. Poetry has a paraphrasable core, quote unquote, paraphrasable core that is coherent, systematic as a scientific statement. I repeat, poetry has a paraphrasable core which is coherent, which is rational, which is systematic as a scientific statement. But the problem, it's not a problem, but the thing that makes literature unique is that this paraphrasable core is actually situated in what he calls in the lively local detail. In what he calls the lively local details. Okay, let me elucidate with an example. Think of a work like, Hamlet. Before going to the example, I'd like to say one thing. John Crow Ransom is a clever critic. He never mentions that which one is which is the paraphrasable core and which is the lively local detail. So this is more or less my interpretation of his writing. I'm not saying that this is exactly what he means, but I'm trying to, put into example just to make you understand what the concept is. Yeah. So the thing is, like think of a play like Hamlet, where you have a story that is rational. A prince whose father is dead and whose mother marries, her husband's brother. And when this prince comes back to his place, he has a lot of issues to face, which is purely rational. But that story has been there for a long time. Think of old Hamlet. Think of the other sources that Shakespeare used. That story was there. But what makes Hamlet classical, or should I say canonical? I don't like that classical term, by the way. I'm pretty much, anti-establishary. Okay. To come back to my example, what makes Hamlet famous is the way Shakespeare treats his subjects, the way Shakespeare uses his language. That is pretty irrelevant to science. So what John Crow Ransom is saying, it is this lively local detail that is irrelevant to science. And when people like Richards try to say that, or even the Neoplatonics try to, reduce Hamlet to that particular message, that that tragic flaw as a message for the generation or the people who reads it, the real problem is that you miss out on that aesthetic feeling. When you read a literary work, you should you should consider the literary work as an ontological living organism. I'll come back to that metaphor once again. According to John Crow Ransom, he compares a poem, this is a beautiful metaphor, by the way, compares a poem to a house having a logical structure with a local texture. Think of a house. നമ്മൾ വീട് വെക്കുമ്പോൾ ഏകദേശം ഒരു പരിധി വരെ എല്ലാ വീടുകൾക്കും ഒരു ലോജിക്കൽ സ്ട്രക്ചർ ഉണ്ടാവും, which is more or less the same. But how we personalize our house, how we make our house unique, is by the decoration and other things that we use. Those things are, that's what makes it unique. That's he means by texture. So even though a work has a paraphrasable core, what makes literature is its language. Someone like Milan Kundera, 50 or so years later, would say that if you want to say a message, better write a pamphlet. Why do you write a novel? Why do you write a poem? If you want to write a poem, if you want to write a novel, subscribe to that particular notion, subscribe to the rules and the things that makes a novel a novel. Use those things, use the language. So according to, again, John Crow Ransom, a poem is like another beautiful metaphor. A poem is like a cream-filled pastry, and a critic is a lavish diner who eats not only the shell of the pastry, but also relishes each drop of the cream as well. ഇതുകൊണ്ടാണ് ഞാൻ പറഞ്ഞത് his title, That World's Body, is pretty much relevant. And he thinks poetry as something that you can consume, something that you enjoy, and something that feeds you. Food കഴിക്കുന്നതുകൊണ്ട് രണ്ട് ഉപയോഗമുണ്ടല്ലോ. You can enjoy eating, and as well as you can satiate hunger. So that there are two purposes for which we eat. അതുപോലെ തന്നെയാണ് poetry വായിക്കുന്നത്. There is this aesthetic side to it, the enjoyment, the experience, rather, they would say. It's not aesthetics, it is the experience. And there's a paraphrasable code that you can use for other purposes if you want. But that's not the only meaning of literature. If you reduce the poem to a paraphrasable code, you're not reading it the proper way. That's exactly what new criticism means, or John Crow Ransom explains as new criticism. He thinks that's what new criticism means. Okay. Just a moment, let me. Yeah, he also says in his writing, poetry is more or less, post-ethical. It's more or less like an Arnoldian concept, Matthew Arnold. He would say that you don't have to take it morally. You take the experience that comes with it. Okay. ഇതിനൊരു എക്സാമ്പിൾ വെച്ച് പറയുകയാണെന്നുണ്ടെങ്കിൽ think of it like more or less like a conversation with people. When you meet a new person, what you're trying to do is that you're trying to understand that person, and you're trying to understand that person and make yourself compatible with him or her, so that you don't behave to each and every person that you know in the same way. We don't speak to your father the same way that we speak to your mother, the same way that we speak to your friends. So each text will tell you rather how to read that particular text. Each text has a way of reading. Each text has a way of reading. Yeah, that's it. It's like finding directions by indirections. It's like saying there is even a method to madness. So ഓരോ ടെക്സ്റ്റ് വായിക്കുന്നതിനും ആ ടെക്സ്റ്റ് വായിച്ചാലേ മനസ്സിലാവുള്ളൂ. ഉദാഹരണത്തിന്, when you open a text, that text will tell you how to read that particular text. If you can't read Italo Calvino and Milan Kundera in the same way. They are more or less like their works incorporates more or less the elements of postmodernity and post-structurality and all that, but you can't read both of them in the same way. In order to learn how to read a text, you will have to engage with the text. To give you another example, a critic is more like a wrestler. He wrestles with the text. Wrestling le nammal fight cheyna poleyana. You wrestle with the text and you come out with your experience. I wouldn't say meaning, your experience. That's what you does. Okay, this is what John Crow Ransom says. And now let's go back to the British side of things, because we have another couple of people to discuss, namely Clint Brooks and his very phenomenal work, The Well-Wrought Urn. And there's another guy who was a disciple of I.A. Richards, William Empson, who wrote the 7 Times of Ambiguity. So what happens here is that there was a question raised by, I think it was Professor Anand Krishnamurthy, who raised a question that isn't it possible to say that William Empson a kind of outdated figure? I would say no. You know why? Because he has still meaning. Let's come back to Clint Brooks for a moment. Clint Brooks, in his essay, not an essay, sorry, in his book, The Well-Wrought Urn, which is actually a demonstration of how you will actually read, you will attempt a new critical reading. He analyzes, he reads, I think it was 9 poems beginning from canonization from John Donne to W.B. Yeats's Among School Children. He gives his own reading of each of these poems. So what he does is that in that particular book, there are 2 chapters which are significant to our discussion. The first one is the language of paradox, and the other chapter is the final chapter, which is the heresy of paraphrase. So what really happens is that all the other chapters are poetic interpretations. He gives his own reading of the poems. So in his essay, or this is also published as an essay, that's why I keep mentioning it as an essay, this language of paradox. So it was later incorporated into this book, I think. So in this particular chapter, language of paradox, Clint Brooks says the language of paradox is inevitably and necessarily the language of poetry. You can't write poetry in a, using referential language. Again, Bill Kundera comes to my mind because I'm mostly a reader of fiction. You can't necessarily use poetry to give a message. You don't do that. Instead, a poet has to create his language as he goes on writing his work. It is when he writes his work, he discovers the particular language that he has to use. Just as a reader discovers the way, the method, the particular method with which you can read a text by engaging with the text, an author also discovers his language as he goes on writing his work. That's what Client Brooks says. And he demonstrates this. And he also says that, referential language is muted, it's more one-sided, that cannot be used for poetic compositions. And he explains it with an example. The example that he uses, he used 3 examples. I'm only going to mention one of them because the others are like, that takes more time than what we have at the moment. So he uses Wordsworth's sonnet. It is a Bodious evening, calm and quiet. I actually request Parvati, if you are there, can you actually share your screen? Can you present us that poem? I asked her because she's she can recite the poem better than I could actually do. That's why I asked her to, do it.
Sir,
Yes.
Sir, Parvati ma'am is not in the meeting. I think she has left.
Okay. It's fine. It's fine.
Anthony, which is the poem? Which is the poem? I can share here.
Okay.
I'll forward it to. I'll forward it to our presenters, so they can do it.
Okay. So then it is the sonnet by Wordsworth. It is a Bodious evening, calm and quiet.
One minute.
Okay. By the time he finds a poem, let's actually move to our discussion, I think. Okay, let's go on with our discussion. He'll come up with the poem, I suppose. Okay, let's go on. That poem is actually something that gives us insight into what practical criticism does, because it says something along like this. It is a common. I don't approve of summarizing a poem, so I won't say that I'm going to summarize it. It's rather you can actually see a narrator and another girl who's actually walking with the narrator in that poem. And this occurs supposedly during an evening when the narrator visits which is typical to Wordsworth, something like a natural habitat, a place which is close to nature, something that Wordsworth often does. So he goes for a walk with this girl, and he describes that the evening as calm and quiet as a holy nun. Now we don't have since we don't have that poem right now, I ask you to understand this. It is pretty much difficult, but still we don't have any other methods. Okay. It is calm and quiet, holy as a nun. And the next line he says, breathless with adoration. Now think about it for a moment. Calm, quiet, holy. Okay, let's take that holy. Let's forget that holy for a moment. Holy as a nun. Calm, quiet, breathless. ഇത് ഒരുമിച്ച് പോകും? I don't think it does. According to Cleant Brooks, what Brooks is trying to say is that Wordsworth, consciously or unconsciously, because it is the play of the language, by the way, this is there, that particular contradiction is there because that gives us a dramatic situation to move to the conclusion. So what he's saying is like, what he's saying is like is that this poet is like wondering throughout this poem. What poet is wondering why this? I'm able to feel the divinity of, nature, divinity in nature, that mighty, thunderous thing in nature that makes me closer to the divinity, closer to the eternal being and all. But why does this girl get? I mean, that girl is actually walking around doing nothing. I mean, she's not behaving as a person who's worshipping. So this contradiction is there, and the conclusion would be given at the final part of the poem. Okay. In order to reach that conclusion, we need a contradiction. We need a dramatic situation. That is part of this, what we call as the aesthetic experience of reading a poem. If you just need a message, state that message. Don't write a poem, okay? If you need the experience of poetry, what you really need is this dramatic situations like this. So this calm and quiet, presented along with this this breathless with adoration, this creates a kind of a contradiction in order to proceed into that kind of, conclusion that the poem gives. You know what that conclusion of that poem gives? The poet says, more or less, I, who am inspired by this particular proximity to, nature, can feel this divinity at this point in time. But you, who have always been lying in the bosom of Abraham, you who have been always with divinity, you feel it even otherwise, without this, this spontaneous touch, this spontaneous factor of nature influencing you to feel the divinity. You don't need that. You are already in a worshipful mode. You have the God within you already. So why do you need nature? That's a conclusion that he gives. And in order to reach that conclusion, the poem presents you with this contradiction, through this irony, through this paradox. That's what he is saying. And this is exactly what new critical reading does. You find out, you pick up a text, you pick up contradictions, you think for yourself why this particular sentence doesn't go with the other sentence. Why this particular sentence doesn't go with the context of the work. Why is that? In a recently published essay, which is kind of an essay that is used by the Oxford or Cambridge, I don't recall at this moment. It was either Oxford or Cambridge. They have published this particular essay on practical criticism, which is kind of in order to give their students an introduction to what the notion of practical criticism is, before asking them to do a new critical reading. So in that particular essay, they clearly mentions that it is not what you understand that matters when you read when you exercise a practical critical reading. It is the things that you don't understand, that you ask yourself, why is it like this? That questions, that things that make you ask that questions is what is important in new criticism or practical criticism. I'll give you another example. Okay. Okay. I want you to, Apu sir, are you there? I also want you to find out another poem for me if you can.
Which one, Anthony?
Have you found out the previous poem, sir, by the way?
I got the three, this thing from Parvati, three documents from Parvati. Which is the next poem?
Yes.
Shall I type it and shall I show it, or shall I present? Shall I have to search for the poem?
It would be nice if you can present the first two stanzas of Raven
Raven.
by
Okay. Yeah, yeah. I'll do it now. Just wait.
Okay. Can you ask your presenters to read that poem if it's possible? Make
I
it
will
more
read.
lively. Okay.
I will read.
That would be much more. Interesting.
Once upon a night, midnight dreary, while I pondered weak and weary over many a quaint and curious volume of forgotten lore, while I nodded, nearly napping, suddenly there came a tapping, as of someone great, gently rapping at my chamber door. "'Tis some visitor," I muttered, tapping at my chamber door, on only this and nothing more.
Can you pause there, sir? Can you pause there
Yes,
for a moment? Yeah.
yes.
Okay. Now look at that. That stanza. A man is. For a moment, let's pretend that we don't know anything about Edgar Allan Poe, which is foolish, I know, and we don't know anything about the context that led to the writing, which is again foolish.
I have joined. If you want me to share the screen, I'm here.
Sorry, sir.
And it's shared.
Okay, fine.
No
Okay.
problem.
All right. Let's if Apu sir, if you can share that poem, it will be nice. The audience can also see that as well. Okay, let's go to that discussion anyway. The first stanza tells you of a narrator or a person or whoever it is, whoever you called it or her for that. That person is actually reading books of traditional knowledge, and it is night. Suddenly, someone taps at the door. ഈ സമയത്ത് നിങ്ങൾ ആലോചിക്കേണ്ട ഒരു കാര്യമുണ്ട്. Okay, for a second I'm going out of the practical new critical way, I'd say, by giving you some info, which is something that you already know. I want you to think about, when we say, okay, I'll explain after this. Got confused for a moment. Sorry for that. Okay, this man or woman is actually reading this book of traditional knowledge. Lore in means a traditional knowledge, and some critics explains it as a book of black art or something like that as well. So this person is reading, and all of a sudden someone is tapping at the door. ഒറ്റയ്ക്കാണ് ഇരിക്കുന്നത്, പുറത്താണ്, ആരോ വന്ന് മുട്ടുന്നുണ്ട്, രാത്രിയാണ്. And his first feeling is like some uninvited guest. ആരോ വിളിക്കാതെ ഈ സമയത്ത് കയറി വരുമോ എന്നുള്ളതാണ് his first feeling. Now, അടുത്ത stanza. Apu sir, are you still there? Hello?
Shall I read? It's already up.
Yeah. Can you read the second stanza?
Yes. Distinctly I remember it was in the bleak December, and each separate dying ember wrought its ghost upon the floor. Eagerly I wished the morrow, vainly I had sought to borrow from my books secretes of sorrow for the lost Lenore, for the rare and radiant maiden whom the angels name Lenore, nameless here forevermore.
Now, okay, thank you sir, thank you very much. Now, ആദ്യത്തെ സ്റ്റാൻസിൽ എന്താ പറഞ്ഞിരുന്നത്? It's just a visitor and nothing more. And രണ്ടാമത്തെ സ്റ്റാൻസിൽ വന്നിട്ട് പറയാണ്, I clearly remember that it was a bleak December. Now, I want you to think about this. Again, ഇവിടെയാണ് ഞാൻ നേരത്തെ പറഞ്ഞ കാര്യം റെലവെന്റ് ആവുന്നത്. I want you to go out of the new critical way just for a second. When you say December, it brings two things to our mind at least. One, for those Christians out there, it is the month of Christmas. pleasant memories. Second, for those, we are specifically now speaking about the Western culture. This poem was written in America, so it is in the Western land. So what happens in December is a winter, and അവരുടെ വിന്റർ എന്ന് പറഞ്ഞാൽ നമ്മുടെ വിന്റർ പോലെ അല്ല, എല്ലാവർക്കും അറിയുന്ന കാര്യമാണ്. ബട്ട് ദെൻ നോ വൺ ക്യാൻ ആക്ച്വലി ഗോ ഔട്ട്. ഇറ്റ്സ് ഫ്രീസിങ് കോൾഡ്. രാത്രിയാണ്. ഈ സമയത്താണ് ആരോ വന്നിട്ട് വാതിലെ മുട്ടും. ഈ ഒരു ലൈനിന്റെ വെളിച്ചത്തിൽ look back at the previous stanza. Only a visitor and nothing more. Don't you see a contradiction? You might be, I think. Each separate dying ember brought its ghost upon the floor. Now, imagine this for a moment. നിങ്ങൾ ഒറ്റയ്ക്ക് ഇരിക്കുവാണ്. ഒറ്റയ്ക്ക് എന്ന് പറയുമ്പോൾ ഒരു രാത്രിയാണ്. യു ആർ സ്പെൻഡിങ് ടൈം വിത്ത് എ ഫ്രണ്ട് ഓർ സമൺ, ആൻഡ് സഡൻലി യു ഹിയർ എ ടാപ്പിംഗ് ഔട്ട്സൈഡ് യുവർ ഡോർ. പെട്ടെന്ന് നിങ്ങളുടെ കൂട്ടുകാരനോ കൂട്ടുകാരിയോ പറയാണ്, ദാ നോക്കൂ, ആ കത്തിച്ചു വെച്ചിരിക്കുന്ന മെഴുകുതിരിയിൽ നിന്ന് വരുന്ന പ്രേതസമാനമായ നിഴലുകൾ നോക്കൂ എന്ന് പറയുന്നു. പറഞ്ഞാൽ എന്തായിരിക്കും അടുത്ത സെക്കൻഡിൽ നിങ്ങളുടെ റെസ്പോൺസ്? ഞാനാണെങ്കിൽ ഒറ്റ അടി വെച്ച് കൊടുക്കും, വേറൊന്നും കൊണ്ടിട്ടല്ല.
Anthony, may I intervene a little bit? Can you just shift to English also, because there are a number of English non-Malayali participants.
All right. Sorry, sir. Sorry. I was since it was mostly an undergrad session.
Yeah. But there are non-Malayali participants also.
All right, sir. I'll do it.
Okay.
So what I'm telling is, you're staying with a friend. No one else is in the house, and you suddenly hear, and it's night time too, and you hear a tapping at the door, and your friend suggests that, look at that dying embers. What does it brings to the table? It just shows, it just brings ghost-like figures. What will you do? If it was me, I'll kick him out. I'll throw him out. I'll throw that friend out of the window. Because just before, in the previous stanza, you have already established that that particular tapping is made by a visitor, an uninvited visitor. And now he's saying it could be something else. It's bleak December, it's winter, no one could get out. It brings ghosts like embers, so ghost and lost Lenore. We don't know if it's his lover or who exactly it is, but what we know is that it's someone who's not here anymore. So what does it brings to the table? It creates a kind of a contradiction. It creates a kind of a horror-stricken situation, I call it. And all right, that's how you actually read. I mean, this is not exactly how you read a new critical poem. The main course is waiting for you would be served on tomorrow and the day after. Dr. Ambat and Dr. Anirudh will give you a taste of what actually it is to read, how to read a poem in a new critical way. But I was trying to give you a taste of what it is like. You are prompted to ask more questions to the text and think for yourself what it means. And it also presents you these contradictions in order to give you that dramatic situation, something like the feeling that you get when you read Hamlet's soliloquy, to be or not to be. You're thrown into that kind of a feeling. Should I die? Should I commit a sin in the Christian sense? Or should I, kill the one who has killed my father, allegedly at least, and be an honest son, justify my position as a son? What should I do? He's in that contradiction, and that contradiction, that dramatic situation, is what the literary text is supposed to present you with. And in one way, I would say, when you pick up a particular text in order to read it, that not meaning that experience is more or less evolutionary. From the first page to the last, you evolve because you learn how to read that particular text. To put in another, to illustrate it, using another example that I think most of my undergrad students will like. Think of it like, since here are more, non-Malayali students, it makes more sense, I think. Think of it like a date. You talk to a person, you try to understand that person, and you try to behave to that person in a particular way. It is told by my friends that you don't date different people. I mean, you date different people in different ways. So it's more or less like that. Each text has its own method of reading, and each text will teach you how to read that particular text. It is not what it says, it is more or less how it says it. That's what is more important when you pick up a text. Now, my time is almost, time is more or less, it's 4:31. So I think I'll take another 10 more minutes and wrap my lecture up. Now, this is exactly what Client Brook is trying to prove in his, in his well-wrought urn. And he also criticizes those who are trying to, paraphrase the poem. That's why he titles it as the heresy of paraphrase. It's a sin in the Christian world. Heresy means sin. Someone who speaks against God is committing heresy. So if you try to summarize a poem, try to, say that this is a crux of the poem or literary work, you are trying to, you are committing a sin against literature. That's what he says, the heresy of paraphrase. Okay, now let's move to Emerson. It's nothing pretty complicated. I initially thought that I shouldn't mention him because it's more or less a minor, I shouldn't call him a minor critic, but then when you compare him with other new critics, he gives us an example of what new criticism is like, but he's often criticized than, appreciated. And someone also asked, isn't he outdated? So that's why I mentioned him. He says, the language, just like Clint Brooks, of poetry is full of paradox and irony. Paradox, according to him, is a literary device which juxtaposes anomalous, contrasting ideas in order to either suggest a striking insight or to resolve all oppositions. Okay, to put it simply, these are opposite ideas combined together. Okay, opposite ideas put in close proximity so that they initially creates a kind of a contradiction. Then that contradiction is solved when you get the deeper insight. That's what it means. And he also explains irony. This is not in his work, The 7 Types of Ambiguity. This is more or less occurs in a later work in which he tries to answer his critics. He says irony occurs when the meaning of a text is warped, is nullified by the immediate context in which it's put. Okay, I shouldn't go back to Malayalam. So the irony occurs when
Anthony, sorry to interrupt you, but if you think Malayalam would give a different effect, you can do both. You can have the effect by using the Malayalam, and maybe you can sum it up in English, because whenever you use it, it has a sort of an effect as well.
Thank you, sir. The thing is, okay, I'll try to do both. Basically, what it means is that it gives you two contrasting, words that suggest two meanings in a single space, which will be resolved into the opposite would be resolved as you read the poem throughout. As we just discussed with Wordsworth, that two approaches of the approach of the narrator and the approach of that girl, how it is resolved into that particular idea of the poem, how it is tied to that particular notion that he's trying to convey. It's not a message, by the way. I shouldn't say that Wordsworth is trying to convey a message. So that's what it does. And in his actual definition of ambiguity, he says ambiguity is not a mistake. It is when linguistic utterances gives room for alternative possibilities. It is when linguistic utterances or linguistic expressions gives room for alternative responses, when you can think, you can extract new meaning out of one. And don't think of the post-structuralists in this context or the postmoderns. I know most of the people who have learned of Derrida, who have learned of post-structuralism, would ask me after this lecture, isn't this the same? Is Emsen more or less, anticipating Derrida? No, he's not. He's not saying that it is ultimately the play of the language or the ultimate deferral of the meaning, where the meaning is already deferred. He's saying is more or less, it is the context in which it makes a different meaning. You can say, when somebody says something, it's interesting. And you can also say, it's interesting. With the tone, you can make, I know I haven't done good, I haven't done a good job with distinguishing the meaning with my tone. I'm not a person who could do that, I think. But I think you got the idea. With the tone, you can actually make such distinctions possible. So with reference to the particular context in which the linguistic utterances are placed, you can actually see the alternative possibilities, alternative responses. That's what he means by and the types of ambiguity. And he goes on to mention the 7 types of ambiguity. And why we think that he's outdated is because we take certain things for granted. This is a world that Emsen is addressing, a world wherein language more or less means one thing. He's responding to society which tries to give emphasis to referential language, scientific language. So in that respect, I should say we should have more historical sense, the contemporaneity, the pastness of the past in its presentness. As I think someone raised that question, how would you use in practical sense that Eliot's criticism of, Eliot's notion of historical sense, how can we put that into practice? This is the one example that I can think of at this moment. You can think, like, say for example, Emsen only becomes outdated when you think that we have grown beyond him. But actually what we need to do is put all of these people in a contemporaneous sense, in a bookshelf, so to speak, and where they exist as with one another rather than proceeding one after other. So that's exactly what new criticism is all about. You should actually pick up a text with no, I shouldn't say no ideas, because we have again gone past new criticism. You should learn how to read a text by reading the text, I should say. I've actually had a couple of examples to present before you. Yeah, I think I have 6 more minutes. Apuza, can you
Yes.
share the screen with, can you just show that third file, the file that is titled Milan?
File titled Milan. Okay.
This is more of a stretch, I know, because I'm not a poet, and I actually was planning to give you, more or less how practical criticism works in prose. So this one, okay.
File titled Milan. Okay.
I'm not a poet, and I actually.
Yes, it's up.
Oh, thank you, sir. Thank you for the confirmation. All right. Okay. Actually, what I don't want you to read through the entire page or something like that. What I want you to understand is that it's actually something that I've taken from Milan Kundera's novel. All right. unbearable lightness of being. So there's some kind of echo. Okay, fine, let's go. It's kind of disturbing. It was kind of disturbing. That's why. Sorry. All right. So this actually, okay. What I've tried to do is, I've put all the phrases or sentences or articulations that shows the narrator. This particular novel has a complicated narrated pattern, I would say, because the narrator is visible. He calls himself I, but he's not your typical first person narrative. He's not included within the action. But then he's not your typical omniscient narrator, because he does not know everything concerning the characters as well. I've tried to bring that contradiction to the forefront by bringing all the things that makes it a bit complicated. In the first part, say for example, the first part he says, I think it was beginning, it occurs during the first part of the novel, where he says that the character is something that I have created. It is something. Thomas and Teresa are two characters in the novel, by the way, to give you some inputs. They came to my mind when I was thinking about something else, when I was thinking about another concept. So what does it mean? It means that character is a creation, okay? It's not a living being, okay? In the next, block, it says, he describes how he had already described another character, Sabina, whom he describes standing half naked besides Thomas, who's fully dressed. I've included this because that also shows the power of the narrator in structuring the novel. He's saying, hey, look at me. I'm the one who structures it. I'm the one who told you about this, but then I've made a mistake. I just forget to tell you something else. This is power in terms of temporal disturbances or structuring the novel, to put it simply, without any theoretical references to it. But in the very next block shows actually an exchange of conversation between Teresa, one of the important character, and with another, an editor. Teresa is actually trying to, get into a job. She's facing an interview. She presents a photo that she took, I think. A photo of Russian invasion of Czech Republic in the 1968. Okay, she actually, while they're talking about this, this particular photo that she has taken, that she has captured, this editor out of the blue mentions another photo which depicts a group of nude people who are relaxing at the beach. So what it shows is that, okay, they brings that particular discussion into the table. He apologizes, the editor apologizes and says, I shouldn't have mentioned that, that doesn't make any sort of connection, because one is more a relaxed sort of life and the other is more like, other is more serious, we could say that. One is light and the other is serious. The unbearable lightness would be. One is heavy and the other is light. But all of a sudden, Teresa says, that's not like that. They have got some sort of connection. And then the narrator intervenes and says, I can't even explain why she said so. At this point, the narrator who told you that I'm the one who created Teresa, I'm the one who created Thomas, I'm the one who, structures the narrative, he comes and says, I don't know what she means. He disowns his powers. This is a contradiction. And this contradiction could only be solved when you read the actual novel. Go and read for yourself, I should say. So, and another thing that I would like to mention, since we are running out of time, I'll just mention it. I won't ask you, Appu sir, to show it before you. So you can refer it afterwards. the time is up actually. I want to briefly mention the novel Heart of Darkness, where you know, Heart of Darkness interpreted or critiqued, I would say, not criticized, critiqued by F.R. Lewis. F.R. Lewis is someone who has put into use the the tradition of new criticism into prose. He explains how Conrad creates a kind of irony by presenting the uncontrollable lust in terms of power and in terms of wildness and whatever that comes with it. I mean, yeah, by referencing earlier by Apu sir. Hello sir, are you there?
Yes, please. I have
Can
shared
you?
the materials in the group.
Okay, fine. You can refer it afterwards. Actually, the first passage actually will tell you how when they were sitting for a dinner, it was interrupted by certain things like flies and other things. And after that, there is a third. I've structured in such a way wherein it appears as a third passage, third paragraph, after a small paragraph, which describes Lewis's comments. The third passage describes you actually how the person, the character Kurtz, actually decorated his house and his place with all of these skeletons and dead skeletons and other things that shows his power and other things. So, and to which he F.R. Lewis contrasts another passage from that appears later in the novel, which describes the meeting between the narrator and the fiance of Kurtz, who's living in Europe. If you read both of those paragraphs after this lecture, you can see an irony which is presented in the novel. The same irony is also foregrounded by Chinua Achebe when he talks about the depiction of African women in Heart of Darkness in his, So, yeah, that's one of the examples. So I would like to sum up by saying that new criticism is not something that asks you to, they try to do that, but they did not ask you to read completely the text in, I don't think it's in isolation. Maybe they have so mostly because literary criticism is, is more like a bumpy ride through a road. I mean, what really happens is, think of a video game, a driving video game. If you are too fast and if you do not have too much control of the vehicle, it's possible that you could go overboard. That could happen. So they were actually trying to distinguish themselves from the previous generation of biographical critics and historical critics. So they try to make that uniqueness possible by going a little too overhead. I should acknowledge that, a little too overhead. But now I should say is the perfect time to read practical critics, because we have seen what practical criticism means. That's one thing. And we have also seen what practical criticism doesn't include. Think of the that poem Raven. If someone like I.A. Richards in our country, someone like Apu sir comes to the class and gives his students a poem, Edgar Allan Poe's Raven, without telling you what kind of a poem it is, and you don't think of these internet connected age. Think of an older time when you don't have access to computer or anything like that. So when you get that poem, the first thing that you will remember when you see I remember that it was in a bleak December, necessarily doesn't bring you that that wintry kind of situation with bleak December wherein no one could get out and no one could actually go out and tap someone else's door at the middle of the night. So we have seen what practical criticism doesn't include through the likes of Stanley Fish and new historicists and whatnot. So we can present all these people in what Eliot called as to, in a historical sense, with the pastness of the past and its present. You can place all of them in a stack. New historics on one side, new critics on one side, and you can take whatever you need. That should be the best way. But remember one thing: you should read, and this is why the text that Parvati mentioned, minimalist interpretations by, you know, Attridge and Henry Staten, becomes very relevant. In that book, Attridge says, we teach our students, not me, he, to be clever critics, but we forget to tell them how to read a text. This is what is important. Do you read the text for just for that story? Do you read the text for that experience? I should suggest you to read Milan Kundera, because Milan Kundera is one person who you know, put he nullifies that notion between story and thrill and suspense and everything. You know why? The story of his characters ends at the middle of the novel. We speak of in medias res, start at the beginning of things, but we never say begin the life of characters at the middle of the novel. So why you read the rest? You read for the experience. With that, let me conclude.
Thank you, sir, for the edifying talk with all those detailings. Now we will move on to the Q&A session.
Sure.
Sir, as of now, there are no questions posted in the chat box, so could you please wait for a few moments until the questions come? Okay, sir,
Definitely.
thank you. Sir, meanwhile, I would like to ask you a question. It's more like a clarification.
Sure.
Okay, sir. So, can we call practical criticism?
I'm not a teacher. You can call my name.
Oh, okay.
Something
Can
that I
we
forgot
call
to mention.
practical? Okay, okay. Can we call practical criticism as a kind of experimentation in reader response criticism?
And before that, I'd just like to add one thing. Uh, you're, you're quite humble, but then one Anthony Joes has cracked the eligibility exam for teachers, NET, National Eligibility Test, 5 times in a row, and you also take classes for NET aspirants in the Sacred Heart College, Tevra, the prestigious college in Ernakulam. So I don't think we cannot call you teachers. There will be so many teachers of you roaming around in Ernakulam. Yeah, sorry. Over to you.
It's all right. Nice comment. I should send him a check after this, I think. Anyways, so you were asking about, can you ask that question once again?
Yeah, sure, sir. Sir, I was asking if we could consider practical criticism as a kind of experimentation in reader response criticism.
It was yes and no, I'd say. You know why? It was an experiment. That's what exactly I.A. Richards did. He went to the class and, presented a bunch of poems to his students and asked them to give their response. But reader response, where they differ, is that they take into account what Stanley Fish calls interpretive communities, wherein the cultural understanding of the reader becomes so relevant. Think of the example that I gave you earlier. If a person is reading Raven in Europe, the first thing that they'll associate with December will be that windy afternoon, evening, wintry situation, not windy, wintry situation. But in our part of the world, December is more kind of pleasant. You have holidays and you have everything. It's more a temperate climate. It's not too hot. So you don't think that you might be, but necessarily you shouldn't think that way. So that is where the understanding of the reader, and I'd also suggest you to read minimalist interpretations, wherein Derek Attridge and Henry Staten kind of argues with whether, I'll use the example that Parvati used, because that would be, that would be familiar for you. They discuss about the sick rose, and when they discuss the term rose, I don't recall who exactly it was, whether it was Attridge or it was Staten, because it appears like a dialogue, more or less a dialogue. So someone says, you know, uh, in the 17th century, Rose brings to its readers the thoughts of virginity, the thought of purity, and the thought of Christian sense of Rosicrucians, if you want to know that. Now, in the 20th century, it does not bring, it should necessarily bring the idea of beauty, but not necessarily, I don't think, purity and all that. Plus, there is something else too. There is also this contrast between dark and certain words that describes gives a feeling of darkness, and when you compare it with rose, which is more vibrant, you can put it in a racist tone as well. Blake is someone who talked about the Christ who painted, the boy who painted the Christ in black. So you can put it in that way as well. Did I mess up anything?
Just adding to it, because you said Derek Attridge, there are two works that requires to be mentioned. One is the work of literature in 2015, and before that, the singularity of literature in 2004. I think it's in the singularity of literature that Attridge mentions what you said right now in that discussion part in 2004.
He might have, but I've read in his latest book, which was published in 2017, The Minimalist Interpretations.
Yeah, okay.
So yeah, so what are the things that you are allowed to think when you hear a word? Words have certain meanings. Think about the cultural studies. You might not be familiar with the idea of emerging, dominant, and residual cultures, but there is something like that. When you think of a term, it may not have the same meaning. It does not bring the same impression to your mind as it was, say, as it might have did for someone lived in the 18th century. So that philological knowledge is something important. And then the other person, I told you this book appears as a dialogue. So other person counters it and says that, when you do that, what's the problem? You go in round and round because you tend to bring in your interpretation. Then it becomes minimalist. It no longer is minimalist interpretations. There should be a boundary between the critic and the creator. I shouldn't say creator, between the text, the critic and the text. It was Matthew Arnold who brought the critic into the limelight, and personally I think we have gone a little too far in privileging critic more than the creator. That's my opinion. You can differ. Any other questions? Have I answered your question?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. That was valuable.
Thank you, sir. You have another question from Naina. So, do you feel that literary criticism differs from Malayalam literature and English literature? Do you feel it differs in each area?
Okay, since this question is from Malayalam, okay. Literary criticism requires this person, literary criticism. What is literary criticism, by the way? I would like to pose this question. I'm sorry for asking questions back, but then you need to understand that term first of all. Literary criticism is a method, as I would call it, is a 2.5 millennia old attempt to justify an answer and more or less to think what literature does. It's an appreciation of what literature does. That is what literary criticism does. Rather than thinking that this is what I said at the beginning of my lecture. I think it went over someone else's head because literary criticism and the criticism of literature are two different things. Criticism of literature is when you say, like Plato, criticism. Literature is not necessary. Literature is not pragmatic. Literary criticism, on the contrary side of things, is appreciating literature. Let me put my key back. Appreciating literature. You try to appreciate whatever is on the page. Sidney tries to say in his defense of poetry that poetry is better than philosophy, better than history, because it combines the precepts of philosophy with the concreteness of history. It doesn't bore you with the stories in the history because it is imaginative. It doesn't, it doesn't go over your head because it does not include the theoretical presumptions of philosophy. It's a balance of both, Sydney says. Its aim is to delight and to teach. And a couple of centuries later, William Wordsworth would say, literature is the finest of all knowledge. If you want to make science and every new discovery human, if you want to make technology human, you need to study literature, because that will help you to understand how it works for humans. Because literature, in my opinion, in my personal opinion, is an attempt to, understand the other with the capital. So Malayalam, definitely, to come back to your question, to be specific, there are Malayalam, there are criticism available in Malayalam. One of my, I was, thinking about one of my mentor, whose name is Sherry Jacob. He has actually told me a couple of, years back, I suppose, in one of the lectures that he delivered, he said that the Malayalam syllabus contains more literary criticism than English. He's talking about specifically the PG Malayalam syllabus, the postgraduate syllabus, not the undergraduate. So definitely you can read, these things in Malayalam as well, but you need to quantify your understanding of, criticism a bit more. Sure. Is there any more questions? I'm not being impatient or anything. I like questions, that's why I'm asking.
Hello, sir. You have a question from Amita. Is it possible to have an emotional or psychological view in practical criticism?
Is it possible to
have an emotional or psychological review in practical criticism?
Yes, but then you shouldn't be influenced by that emotion too much. It's a balance of both, I would say, because this is why I say teachers used to tell me that you need to read a book twice. When I was reading, say for example, something like a traditional social realist novel, my intention would be to know what the story is all about. My emotions are like I'm emotional. I want to know what happens next. I want to know what's going on with the characters' lives. But when you reread it, what really happens is that you get to see how that work becomes unique in its own right. I've never seen the beauty of Dickens when I was reading Oliver Twist for the first time. I never get to observe that. I was into the story. But if you read someone like, I'd say, again, I'm going back to Kundera, sorry, I like his works too much. That will be the reason. Or Italo Calvino, for that matter. What will happen is that those guys will throw some interruptions from the authorial part in order to make you understand that this is a fiction and this is created. You don't have to put your all emotions in there. You can be more critical if you want. You can look at the language if you want. So it's more based on what you read. If you read postmodern, post-structural, everything, not everything that comes after 1960s, because everything that comes after 1960s is not postmodern and post-structural. But if you think that this work goes in the postmodern, post-structural tradition, you will be interrupted, I think. But if you are reading a traditional novel, it's good to stop at times, because appreciation of language is also good. When you look at the language, this is what actually close reading does to you. You get to feel the certain things that you've never felt before. You never, even when I was reading that Derek Attridge's book, I never thought that you could bring this much of meaning into the discussion of this poem. I was just reading it's a rose. It's rose destroyed by something else, and I metaphorically, interpreted it as I'm a bad reader of poetry by any means. I don't read much of poetry, and I'm a bad interpreter too. So I allegorically interpret it as it is something that the desires describing destroying yourself, your desires destroying yourself. I interpreted it that way. I think that was wrong. I realized that. So it's better to pause, and it's better to read it twice or thrice if you want.
How do we access or analyze the success of the aesthetics of independent emotional beliefs in any work? And she's adding this observation: still, we can't accurately define its success or the outcome of the emotional factor, even inevitable.
I was actually thinking of answering it that way, but since you've already mentioned it, you've put me in a trap. I salute that question. It's really good. That's the problem of it. Why do you have to be like? Why do I think that I have to, judge whether a portrayal is successful or not? Why do you say that, Marcel Proust is good and James Joyce is bad? Or why do you say that, those people who wrote the social realism, someone like Dickens is bad and the postmodern, the Kundera and all those people are good? Why do you say that? Why do you have to say that? That's what I'm asking. You don't. You read a text. That's what I'm saying. Only when you read a text, you learn to read that text. Think it that way. You're trying. Do you go to meet a new friend with some kind of, what would be the effect if you go to meet a person whom you meet in a social media these days? It's possible. Since we can't go out, we might meet people in social media. So it's possible to meet people in social media. So how would it be to go with your own biases, your own, feelings and your own opinion about that person? Having something in mind. You need to go fresh, just as you pick up a text with a fresh mind. People used to ask me, "Who's your favorite author?" And I had this habit of saying I don't have any favorites to those people who ask me for my favorites, because that will actually lead them ask them to consider that particular author, him or her, as a superior being about or anyone else that they might be knowing. So it's a step in the dangerous direction. So I never used to do that. But there are people I like, obviously. But whenever I pick up a book, I pick up with an open mind. And I would answer your question that you don't have to judge it. You can appreciate it, and you can obviously make your own subjective remarks, whether it pleased me, whether it did not please me. That's possible, but that is not objective. That's not universal. So you've got to tolerate it. Multivalence is what I mean. Multiple voices, you need to tolerate that.
Thank you, sir. We have come to the end of the question and answer session. Thank you again, sir, for your wonderful talk.
Thank you.
Now I invite Shruti for the vote of thanks.
Good evening, everyone. I deem it a great honor to propose vote of thanks on this memorable occasion. First and foremost, let me thank the God Almighty for making the program a resounding success. Our sincere thanks to the resource persons, Ms. Parvati Salil and Mr. Anthony Jose, for their interesting and engaging sessions. Our heartfelt thanks to Vice Principal Dr. Mini Chaco and Head of Department English Professor Sini Rachel Matthew for their words and presence. I must also thank the course director Professor Dito Prasad, the convener Dr. Apu Jacob John, and the faculty of English Department for the valuable guidance and encouragement. I also thank the comparers of today's session, Samya and Ria, my classmates, for guiding us throughout the program. Last but not the least, I would like to thank all the participants for their cooperation towards making the program even more enjoyable. Once again, thank you all.
Excuse me, can I take a moment before quitting?
Yes, sir.
Yeah. I would also like to, it was an it was an immense opportunity to come here and talk to you about all these things, about literature and criticism and all these things. So I would ask all of my listeners to go with a fresh mind. You can think of all these things, but when you go for the next session, go with a fresh mind and see how they, approaches practical criticism. And also, I've used this occasion to tell you that you can actually write me at my mail ID, which is anjo1297@gmail.com, about your questions and discussions of literature. If you're interested, I'm always interested to talk about literature and these things. You can post your questions, and I'm not sure whether I can answer all of your questions and everything, but we'll have a discussion. Thank you.
Yeah, I would also appreciate questions from everyone on Facebook or mail ID. Thank you so much, everyone. We're students, and thank you so much for giving us an opportunity to discuss about all of these. And I would urge everyone to attend the session by Dr. Rampad Koshi and Dr. Anirudh Sridhar. So, yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you, Anthony, sir, and Parvati, ma'am. With this, we come to the end of the day one of our workshop. Tomorrow, we will be having a session by Dr. A.V. Koshi, Jazan University, Saudi Arabia. We expect your kind participation in all the coming sessions too. Thank you. Thank you once again.